On the 20th of May, 1498, a man with sun-blackened skin and a beard matted with salt stood at the bow of a battered carrack and watched the green coastline of India materialize through the monsoon haze. He had been at sea for nearly 11 months. He had sailed farther from home than any European in recorded history. Behind him, 2 of his 4 ships still floated, their hulls riddled with worm, their sails patched and repatched until the original canvas was barely a memory. Of the 170 men who had departed Lisbon the previous July, scurvy had already killed dozens. Their gums had turned black. Their teeth had loosened and fallen out like seeds shaken from a dried pod. Some had gone blind. Others had simply stopped breathing in the night. Their bodies slipped overboard at dawn with a muttered prayer and a splash that no one lingered to watch. The man's name was Vasco da Gama. He was not a scientist, not a visionary, not a philosopher of exploration. He was a minor Portuguese nobleman with a reputation for cold-blooded violence and an unshakable belief that God had chosen his nation for something extraordinary. And in a sense, God had, or geography had, or desperation had, because the country that sent Vasco da Gama around the bottom of Africa and across the Indian Ocean to the pepper markets of Calicut was not England, with its growing naval tradition. It was not Spain, which had only just sent Columbus stumbling into the Caribbean. It was not France or the Holy Roman Empire or the Ottoman Sultanate, in any of which commanded populations and resources that dwarfed what this slender nation could muster. It was Portugal, a country roughly the size of the American state of Indiana, a country with fewer than 1 million people, a country that occupied a thin strip of Atlantic coastline on the western edge of Europe, boxed in on 3 sides by the vast bulk of Castile and on the 4th by an ocean that most medieval Europeans regarded as a boundless void leading nowhere. And yet this country, this improbable, underpopulated, resource-poor country, was about to build the first global empire in human history. Within a single generation of da Gama's landing in India, Portuguese ships, soldiers, missionaries, and merchants would be found on every inhabited continent on Earth. Portuguese fortresses would control the choke points of the Indian Ocean. Portuguese traders would reach China, Japan, and the islands of Southeast Asia. Portuguese colonists would claim a territory in South America larger than all of Western Europe combined. For more than a century, this nation of fewer than 1.5 million souls would dominate global trade, project military power across 4 continents and 3 oceans simultaneously, and fundamentally reshape the way human beings understood the planet they lived on. How this happened, why it happened, and what it cost is one of the most extraordinary and troubling stories in human history. The primary sources for what follows are unusually rich. The Portuguese were meticulous record keepers, perhaps because they understood, even at the time, that what they were doing was unprecedented. The chronicler João de Barros spent decades compiling his Décadas de Ásia, a massive history of Portuguese expansion in the East drawn from official correspondence, ships' logs, and interviews with returning sailors and soldiers. Fernão Lopes de Castanheira accompanied Portuguese expeditions to India and spent 40 years writing a history based on what he witnessed firsthand and what survivors told him in the dockyards of Lisbon. Tomé Pires, an apothecary who sailed to Malacca in 1512, wrote the Summa Oriental, the first European account of the trade networks of the entire Asian maritime world, compiled from his own observations and from conversations with merchants who had sailed routes no European had ever charted. And then there is Gaspar Correa, who lived in India for decades and wrote his Lendas de India with the unsentimental eye of a man who had watched an empire being built through blood and commerce in equal measure. These men did not write sanitized histories. They recorded massacres alongside navigational triumphs, cruelty alongside courage, because that was the reality of what Portugal did to the world and what the world did to Portugal. To understand how a country of 1 million people conquered half the globe, you have to first understand what Portugal was in the century before it began reaching outward, and why the ocean was not one option among many, but the only option available. In the year 1400, Portugal was the poorest kingdom in Western Europe. This was not a relative judgment. It was an observable fact that any traveler crossing the Iberian Peninsula from east to west would have confirmed. The great cities of medieval Europe, the Venice and Florences and Bruges of the continent, were centers of banking, textile production, and long-distance trade. They sat at the intersections of overland routes that connected the Mediterranean to the Baltic, the Silk Road to the wool markets of Flanders. Portugal sat at the intersection of nothing. It was the end of the road, the last stop before the Atlantic. The land itself was not generous. The northern provinces were green and mountainous, suitable for small-scale farming, but not for the kind of grain surplus that built empires. The southern regions, the Alentejo and the Algarve, were drier, flatter, and bore the scars of 5 centuries of intermittent warfare between Christian and Moorish kingdoms. The Reconquista, the long, grinding campaign to push Islamic rule off the Iberian Peninsula, had defined Portugal's national identity since its founding as an independent kingdom in 1139. By the time the last Moorish stronghold in Portugal fell in 1249, more than a century before the rest of Iberia completed the same process, the Portuguese had developed a national character forged in perpetual conflict, a culture that equated territorial expansion with divine mission and military service with spiritual virtue. But the Reconquista's end created a problem that would prove more consequential than the wars themselves. Portugal had finished expanding on land. To the east and north lay Castile, a kingdom 5 times its size, and with 5 times its population, and a long history of treating Portugal as a wayward province that might, with sufficient pressure, be reabsorbed. The border between Portugal and Castile was not a natural boundary of mountains or rivers, not for most of its length. It was a political line maintained by diplomacy, marriage alliances, and the threat of armed resistance. Every Portuguese monarch understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who sleeps next to a much larger neighbor, that Castile could swallow them whenever the political calculus shifted. To the west and south lay the Atlantic Ocean. And in 1400, the Atlantic was not the highway it would later become. It was a wall. Consider what the ocean meant to a European of the early 15th century. The Mediterranean was known. Its currents, its winds, its coastlines, its ports. Its dangers had been charted and cataloged for millennia. Phoenician, Greek, Roman, Arab, Venetian, and Genoese sailors had crisscrossed its waters for so long that maritime trade in the Mediterranean was as routine as overland caravanning. But the Atlantic beyond the Strait of Gibraltar was something else entirely. The prevailing winds along the African coast blew from the north, which meant that a ship sailing south along the coast could make good progress, but turning around and sailing back against those same winds was extraordinarily difficult with the square-rigged vessels of the era. The currents pushed outward, away from land, into open water where no coastline offered shelter and no port offered resupply. Beyond the Canary Islands, just off the northwest coast of Africa, European knowledge effectively ended. Sailors spoke of Cape Bojador, a rocky headland on the coast of what is now Western Sahara, as a point of no return. The waters beyond it were said to boil. Sea monsters were reputed to patrol the depths. The sun, it was claimed, burned so fiercely that it turned a white man's skin permanently black. These were not fairy tales told to children. These were the operating assumptions of experienced mariners repeated in nautical charts and sailing manuals, reinforced by the practical reality that no European ship had ever sailed beyond Bojador and returned. This was the world into which Henrique of Portugal was born in 1394, the third son of King Joan I and his English queen Philippa of Lancaster. History would call him Henry the Navigator, a title that was itself a kind of lie, because Henry never navigated anything. He was not a sailor. He did not cross oceans or chart unknown coastlines. He spent most of his adult life at Sagres, on the windswept southwestern tip of Portugal, where the land ended in cliffs that dropped straight into the Atlantic and the wind never stopped blowing. What Henry did was something that required a different kind of courage than sailing. He spent money, year after year, decade after decade, funding voyages into the unknown when every voyage returned with nothing, or did not return at all. Henry was tall, powerfully built, and ascetic in his personal habits. He never married. He ate simply. He wore dark clothing and spent hours in prayer. Those who knew him described a man of intense religious conviction and equally intense ambition. Though whether the religion served the ambition or the ambition served the religion was a question that even his contemporaries could not satisfactorily answer. He had fought at the siege of Ceuta in 1415, when a Portuguese fleet crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and captured the Moorish trading city on the North African coast. It was Portugal's first overseas military adventure, and it changed Henry permanently. In Ceuta's warehouses, he saw gold, ivory, pepper, and silks that had traveled across the Sahara from the kingdoms of sub-Saharan Africa. He learned from captured merchants and from his own intelligence gathering that the gold funding the great Islamic civilizations of North Africa came from mines deep in West Africa, transported north by camel caravan across thousands of miles of desert. The overland route was controlled entirely by Muslim traders and Saharan nomads. No Christian had ever penetrated those networks. No Christian was welcome to try. But Henry looked at a map, if you could call the rough Portolan charts of the era maps, and saw something that seems obvious now but was radical then. Africa was a land mass. It had a western coast. That coast faced the Atlantic. If Portuguese ships could sail south along that coast far enough, they could reach the source of the gold without crossing a single grain of Saharan sand. They could bypass the entire Islamic trading network. They could reach the wealth at its origin. It was an idea of breathtaking simplicity and equally breathtaking in practicality. No one knew how far South Africa extended. No one knew if the coast was navigable. And no one knew what lay beyond Cape Bojador. And the ship technology of 1420 was simply not adequate for the task. The standard European merchant vessel of the era was the barca or the baronel, square-rigged ships designed for the relatively calm and predictable waters of the Mediterranean or the short coastal runs of the European Atlantic seaboard. These ships could not sail close to the wind. They could not maneuver in shallow coastal waters. And most critically, they could not beat back northward against the prevailing winds and currents of the African coast. A captain who sailed south past Bojador in a square-rigged ship would find himself unable to return home. Henry began sending ships south in 1419. For 15 years, expedition after expedition turned back at or before Cape Bojador. 15 expeditions by some counts, 15 times. Captains reached the waters off that unremarkable headland and could not bring themselves to continue. The fear was not irrational. The coastal waters near Bojador were genuinely treacherous, shallow and studded with reefs, swept by unpredictable currents, prone to fogs that could disorient a navigator within minutes. Several ships were lost. Others returned with crews half dead from thirst and exposure. Henry funded them all. He mortgaged the revenues of the Order of Christ, the wealthy religious military order of which he was governor. He borrowed from Florentine and Genoese bankers, he diverted income from his personal estates, and he sent the ships out again. In 1434, a squire named Gil Enos finally rounded Cape Bojador and returned alive. He brought back nothing of value, no gold, no spices, and no evidence of habitable lands or rich kingdoms. What he brought back was a single branch of rosemary plucked from the shore beyond the cape, proof that the land to the south supported plant life, and that the sea did not boil, and that the sun did not destroy a man's flesh. It sounds absurd now. A branch of rosemary as a breakthrough in human exploration. But the psychological barrier that Gil Eanes broke was more formidable than any physical one he would face. He had proven that the unknown was survivable, and surviving the unknown was the only competitive advantage Portugal had. It was around this time, in the shipyards of Lagos and Lisbon, that Portuguese craftsmen began developing the vessel that would change the course of history. The The caravel was not invented in a single moment of inspiration. It evolved over decades, a response to the specific demands of Atlantic coastal exploration. It drew on the lateen-rigged fishing boats of the Algarve, the North African dhow traditions that Portuguese shipwrights had studied in Ceuta, and the hard-won lessons of every failed expedition down the African coast. The caravel was small, typically between 50 and 70 feet in length, with a shallow draft that allowed it to navigate close to shore and enter river mouths that would ground a larger vessel. Its critical innovation was the lateen sail, the triangular sail set on a long yard at an angle to the mast, a design borrowed from Arab seafaring tradition. The lateen sail allowed the caravel to sail much closer to the wind than any square-rigged vessel could manage. A caravel could tack, zigzagging into a headwind to make progress in a direction that would have been impossible for a square rigger. This meant that for the first time, a ship that sailed south along the African coast could also sail back north. The trap that had defeated every previous expedition was broken. The caravel was also fast, agile, and surprisingly seaworthy for its size. It could outrun larger vessels. It could be handled by a crew of 20 to 30 men, which reduced the cost of provisioning and the political difficulty of recruiting. And it could be built cheaply enough that the loss of one or two ships would not bankrupt the enterprise. Henry ordered caravels built in increasing numbers, and the ships began pushing further south. Through the 1440s and 1450s, Portuguese caravels crept down the West African coast in increments that seem agonizingly slow by modern standards, but were revolutionary at the time. Each expedition reached a few hundred miles further than the last. Each returned with slightly more detailed charts, slightly more accurate readings of latitude, slightly more information about winds and currents. The navigators developed the technique of the volta do mar, the return through the sea, a wide looping course far out into the Atlantic that caught westerly winds to carry them home, rather than the impossible direct route north against the coastal headwinds. This was a counterintuitive solution that required sailing away from home in order to reach it, adding hundreds of miles to the return journey but making it possible at all. The methodical nature of this exploration cannot be overstated. Portugal was not throwing ships at the ocean and hoping for the best. It was building, year by year, an accumulated body of navigational knowledge that existed nowhere else in the world. The charts came back. They were copied, compared, corrected. The latitude readings were compiled. The information about winds, currents, depths, anchorages, sources of fresh water, and hostile or friendly populations was cataloged with bureaucratic precision. This was exploration as institutional project, funded by the state, organized by the crown, and maintained across decades regardless of short-term results. And the results for a long time were short-term indeed. Henry the Navigator died in 1460, having spent roughly 40 years and a staggering amount of money funding Atlantic exploration. At the time of his death, Portuguese ships had reached approximately the coast of modern Sierra Leone. That is roughly 2,000 miles south of Lisbon. It was an extraordinary achievement by any historical standard, and it was also, from a commercial perspective, almost entirely useless. The gold sources of West Africa had been tapped to some degree, with Portuguese traders establishing small posts along the Guinea coast. The slave trade had begun, with the first shipments of enslaved Africans arriving in Lagos as early as 1444, an enterprise that Henry personally endorsed and profited from, and that would grow into one of the most monstrous institutions in human history. But the grand strategic prize, a sea route to the wealth of Asia, remained as distant as ever. Africa stretched on, its coast curving eastward, then southward again, its extent unknown, its end a matter of pure speculation. Henry the Navigator's legacy was not gold or spices or territorial conquest. It was infrastructure. He had created a system of exploration that could survive the death of any individual, even its founder. He had established the financial mechanisms, the shipbuilding capacity, the navigational schools, the cartographic archives, and the institutional memory that would allow Portugal to continue pushing south long after the prince who started the project was buried in his monastery at Batalha. He had built, in effect, the world's first research and development program for oceanic exploration. The generation that followed Henry understood what they had inherited, and they understood what was at stake if they failed to press the advantage. The problem was not merely geographic, the problem was economic, and it was existential. By the mid-15th century, the wealth of the known world flowed through a system of trade routes that Portugal was entirely excluded from. The spices of the East, pepper and cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg, the commodities that Europeans craved with an intensity difficult to comprehend today, traveled from their origins in India, Ceylon, and the islands of Southeast Asia through a chain of middlemen so long and so profitable that by the time a single pound of pepper reached a European table, it had been marked up by a factor of 100 or more. The routes were controlled at every stage by someone else. Arab dhows carried the spices across the Indian Ocean to the ports of the Red Sea and the Persian Gulf. Egyptian and Mamluk merchants transported them overland to the Mediterranean ports of Alexandria and Beirut. Venetian and Genoese galleys loaded them there and carried them to the markets of Europe. At every transfer point, someone took a cut. The sultans of Egypt levied customs duties. The merchants of Cairo took their commissions. The Venetian Republic, which had negotiated monopoly trading rights in Alexandria, added its own enormous markup before distributing the goods to the rest of Europe. Venice had grown fabulously wealthy on this system. The Venetian merchant fleet was the largest in Europe. Venetian bankers financed half the crowned heads of the continent. Venetian palaces rose along the Grand Canal in displays of wealth that made visiting dignitaries from other nations stare in open envy. And all of it, every gilded ceiling, every marble facade was built on the fact that Venice controlled the European end of the spice trade and no one else could access the source. Portugal wanted to break that monopoly, not reduce it, not negotiate a share, break it entirely. And the only way to do that was to find a route to the source of the spices that bypassed every middleman, every toll collector, every Venetian galley and Egyptian customs house between Lisbon and the pepper gardens of Malabar. The route was south. Around Africa, if Africa could be rounded, into the Indian Ocean, if the Indian Ocean could be reached, and all the way to India if India could be found from that direction. It was an enterprise so audacious that most of educated Europe regarded it as either impossible or insane. The technical challenges were enormous. The distances involved were far greater than anything European seamanship had ever attempted. The financial cost was staggering for a nation of Portugal's limited resources, and the political risks were severe because Portugal was not operating in a vacuum. Castile, soon to become Spain through its union with Aragon, had its own Atlantic ambitions. The papacy brokered competing claims to newly discovered territories, and the Islamic powers that controlled the existing spice routes had every reason to destroy any Christian interloper who threatened their monopoly. But Portugal had something that no other nation possessed. It had 40 years of accumulated knowledge about the Atlantic. It had the caravel. It had navigators trained in techniques that existed nowhere else, and it had the institutional commitment, embedded now in the very identity of the Portuguese crown, to keep pushing south until the continent ended or the ships ran out. After Henry's death, there was a brief pause. King Afonso V was more interested in Moroccan campaigns than in Atlantic exploration. But in 1481, a new king ascended the Portuguese throne who would transform Henry's dream into strategic policy. João II was everything a 15th century monarch needed to be: intelligent, ruthless, politically astute, and utterly convinced that Portugal's future lay not in the dusty fortresses of North Africa, but in the uncharted waters of the South Atlantic. João reorganized the exploration program, increased funding. I dispatched new expeditions with explicit instructions to find the southern limit of Africa, and began building the diplomatic and intelligence networks that would prepare the ground for whatever lay beyond. It was João who sent Bartolomeu Dias south in August of 1487 with 2 caravels and a supply ship, carrying orders that were as simple in their formulation as they were staggering in their ambition. Sail south. Find where Africa ends. Round it if you can. Dias was an experienced navigator from a family of navigators. His grandfather had sailed with Henry's early expeditions. His father had captained ships along the Guinea coast. The sea was not an abstraction to Bartolomeo Dias. It was the family business. He departed Lisbon in the late summer and followed the now familiar route south along the African coast. I passed the trading posts of Guinea, past the equator, into waters that grew progressively colder and rougher as the ships pushed further south than any Portuguese expedition had gone before. And then somewhere off the coast of what is now Namibia, in the first days of January 1488, Dias sailed into a storm that would last 13 days. The ships were driven south and then east, completely out of sight of land, battered by winds and seas that the crews had never experienced. The supply ship, slower and less maneuverable than the caravels, fell behind and was never seen again during the voyage. The two remaining caravels, tiny vessels barely 70 feet long, were tossed through mountainous swells in water so cold that spray froze on the rigging. Dias could not take celestial readings. He could not determine his position. He could only hold his course as best he could and wait for the storm to break. When it finally did, and Dias turned east expecting to find the African coast, there was nothing there. Only open ocean stretching to the horizon. He sailed north. Still nothing. It was then that Dias understood what had happened. The storm had carried him around the southern tip of Africa without his ever seeing it. The continent had ended. He was in the Indian Ocean. He turned northeast and made landfall on the coast of what is now South Africa, in a bay he named Aguada de São Brás. The land was green and temperate. Cattle herded by Khoikhoi pastoralists grazed on hillsides within sight of the beach. It was a landscape that bore no resemblance to the arid coasts of the Sahara or the tropical forests of Guinea. It was proof, unmistakable and undeniable, that Africa had a southern limit, and that the Indian Ocean was accessible by sea from the Atlantic. Dias wanted to continue east. His crews refused. They had been at sea for months. The supply ship was gone. Food was running low, and the men were exhausted, frightened, and unwilling to sail further into unknown waters with no guarantee of return. Dias, by his own later account, wept with frustration. He had the southern tip of Africa behind him and the trade routes of the Indian Ocean ahead, and his men would not let him reach them. He turned back. On the return voyage, he finally saw the cape that the storm had hidden from him on the way south. He named it the Cape of Storms. King Juan, with the instinct of a man who understood that naming was a form of conquest, renamed it the Cape of Good Hope. Dias reached Lisbon in December of 1488. He had been gone 16 months. He had lost one ship and an unknown number of men. He had not reached India. He had not found spices or established trade. But he had answered the question that had driven Portuguese exploration for 70 years. Africa could be rounded. The Indian Ocean could be reached. The sea route to the east existed. It would take another decade before Portugal exploited this knowledge. There were political complications, diplomatic negotiations with Spain over competing claims to newly discovered lands, intelligence operations to determine what actually awaited a Portuguese fleet in the Indian Ocean. Juan II died in 1495 and was succeeded by Manuel I, a king whose ambition matched his predecessors, but whose temperament was more flamboyant, more grandiose, and more attuned to the theatrical possibilities of empire. It was Manuel who chose Vasco da Gama for the mission that would change the world, and it is here, with da Gama's fleet being assembled in the shipyards of Lisbon in the early months of 1497, that the story of Portuguese imperial conquest truly begins. Everything before this, Henry's decades of incremental progress, the development of the caravel, the rounding of the Cape, was prologue. The next chapter would be written not in the language of exploration, but in the language of commerce, diplomacy, and war. And it would be written in blood as often as in ink. The man Manuel chose was not the obvious candidate. Vasco da Gama was 37 years old, a minor nobleman from the provincial town of Sines on the Alentejo coast, and his experience at sea, while real, was not exceptional by the standards of Portugal's deep bench of navigators. Bartolomeu Dias, who had actually rounded the Cape, was alive, available, and incomparably more qualified for the voyage. João de Barros, the great chronicler, would later note that the selection puzzled many at court. Dias was passed over, so was his brother Diogo. So were several other veterans of the African coast who had spent years building the navigational knowledge that made the India voyage possible. Manuel chose da Gama for reasons that had less to do with seamanship than with the kind of man the king believed he was sending into the unknown. Da Gama was physically imposing, hard-faced, and possessed of a temperament that contemporaries described with words that clustered around a consistent theme: proud, quick to anger, unbending, and merciless when he believed himself crossed. He was, in the language of his own time, a fidalgo of the sword rather than the pen, a man whose instinct in any confrontation was to escalate rather than negotiate. Fernão Lopes de Castanheira recorded that da Gama inspired both respect and fear in roughly equal measure, and that even those who served him loyally did so with the wariness of men who understood that his approval could curdle into violence without warning. Manuel wanted this. He was not sending an ambassador. He was not sending a scientist. He was sending the sharp end of a spear into a world that Portugal knew almost nothing about, a world of established empires, sophisticated navies, and trading networks that had functioned for centuries without European participation. The king needed a man who would not be intimidated by what he found, a man who would plant the Portuguese flag and defend it regardless of the odds, a man who, if diplomacy failed, would reach for the cannon without hesitation. Da Gama was given 4 ships. The flagship, the São Gabriel, and her sister ship, the São Rafael, were not caravels but larger, heavier naus, square-rigged vessels with higher sides and greater cargo capacity, specifically designed for the long ocean voyage and the expectation that they would return loaded with trade goods. The Berrio was a smaller caravel, faster and more maneuverable, useful for coastal reconnaissance. The 4th vessel was an unnamed supply ship, a floating warehouse packed with provisions for a journey whose duration could only be guessed at. The fleet carried approximately 170 men, including sailors, soldiers, interpreters, and convicts who had been brought along for the most dangerous tasks, the ones where someone needed to go ashore first in unknown territory, and the crown preferred to risk men who were already condemned. The ships also carried something else. In their holds, alongside the salt meat, the biscuit, the barrels of water and wine, the spare sails and timber and rope, were stone pillars called padrões, carved with the Portuguese royal arms and a Christian cross. These were sovereignty markers. Da Gama's instructions were to erect them at key points along his route, physical declarations that the land and the sea around it belonged to Portugal by right of discovery and divine mandate. He also carried trade goods selected by advisors who had only the vaguest understanding of what Indian Ocean merchants might want. Striped cloth, coral beads, sugar, honey, wash basins. It was a collection that would prove embarrassingly inadequate. The merchants of Calicut, accustomed to trading in gold, silver, and fine textiles, would look at da Gama's offerings with something between amusement and contempt. The fleet departed Lisbon on the 8th of July, 1497. The departure was a public spectacle, orchestrated by Manuel with the showmanship that would become his signature. The king accompanied the crews to the waterfront. Mass was said. Banners were blessed. The population of Lisbon lined the riverbanks of the Tagus and watched the 4 ships catch the outgoing tide and move downstream toward the open Atlantic. Many in the crowd were weeping. The chronicles record this detail without sentimentality. These were people who understood the mathematics of Portuguese exploration. A significant percentage of the men on those ships were not coming home, and everyone on the riverbank knew it. Da Gama followed the African coast south to the Cape Verde Islands, the last familiar waypoint, and then made a decision that revealed either extraordinary confidence in Portuguese navigational science or a recklessness bordering on insanity. Rather than hugging the African coast south as Dias had done, da Gama turned his fleet southwest, away from land, into the open South Atlantic. He sailed west and south in a vast arc that took him closer to the coast of Brazil, which would not be officially discovered for another 3 years. Than to the African coast he was supposedly following. This was the Volta do Mar on an oceanic scale, a deliberate detour of thousands of miles designed to catch the westerly winds of the southern Atlantic that would carry the fleet east and south around the Cape of Good Hope. For 96 days, da Gama's fleet sailed without sight of land. 96 days. No European fleet had ever spent so long in open ocean. The navigators had charts that ended where their knowledge ended, which was roughly at the equator on the Atlantic side. Beyond that, they were sailing on theory, on the accumulated observations of wind patterns compiled by decades of Portuguese exploration, and on faith. The crews ate their way through the provisions. They watched the stars wheel into unfamiliar configurations as the fleet crossed the equator and pushed into the southern hemisphere. The Southern Cross rose above the horizon, and the North Star, the ancient companion of every European navigator, sank below it and disappeared. When they finally made landfall on the 4th of November 1497 at a bay on the South African coast they named Santa Helena, the men had been at sea for over 3 months. They were not yet at the Cape. They still had to round the southern tip of Africa, navigate the treacherous currents and storms that had nearly destroyed Dias 9 years earlier, and then sail north and east across the entire width of the Indian Ocean to reach India. They were, by any reasonable calculation, less than halfway through their journey, and the hardest part lay ahead. And the rounding of the Cape was brutal. The seas off southern Africa, where the cold Bengala current from the Atlantic collides with the warm Agulhas current from the Indian Ocean, produce some of the most dangerous sailing conditions on Earth. Massive swells, sudden storms, currents that can reverse a ship's progress overnight. Da Gama's fleet spent weeks battling headwinds and contrary currents, tacking back and forth within sight of a coast they could not land on, the crews growing more exhausted and more frightened with each passing day. The supply ship was deliberately scuttled during this period, its provisions distributed among the remaining 3 vessels because the fleet could not afford to slow its pace for the slowest ship, and the supply vessel was taking on water faster than it could be pumped. They rounded the Cape in late November and entered the Indian Ocean. And here, the nature of the voyage changed fundamentally. Along the African coast of the Atlantic, the Portuguese had encountered populations that were technologically and militarily inferior to them, peoples without firearms, without ocean-going vessels, without the kind of centralized political organization that could mount effective resistance to armed Europeans. The Indian Ocean was different. The Indian Ocean was the most commercially sophisticated body of water on Earth, crisscrossed by trading networks that had been operating for over 1,000 years, connecting the markets of East Africa to the merchants of Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. The cities of the East African coast, Sofala, Kilwa, Mombasa, Malindi, were not primitive villages, or they were prosperous trading ports built of coral stone, governed by sultans who wore silk and dined on Chinese porcelain, connected by ties of commerce, religion, and kinship to the wider Islamic world. Da Gama sailed up this coast through December and January, stopping at several ports. The receptions varied. At some, the local rulers were cautiously welcoming. At others, they were hostile. At Mozambique, Da Gama's fleet was initially well received until the Sultan realized that these visitors were Christians, not Muslims, and that their trade goods were worthless by Indian Ocean standards. The relationship deteriorated rapidly. Da Gama responded by bombarding the town from his ships before departing, applying an act of violence that was wildly disproportionate to the provocation and that established a pattern he would repeat throughout the voyage. When met with resistance, Da Gama did not negotiate. He did not withdraw. He attacked. At Mombasa, the reception was openly hostile. The Sultan, forewarned by messengers from Mozambique, attempted to lure the Portuguese ships into the harbor where they could be overwhelmed. Da Gama suspected a trap. He tortured captives taken from local boats by dripping boiling oil on their skin until they confirmed his suspicions. The fleet moved on. At Malindi, finally, da Gama found a ruler willing to cooperate. The Sultan of Malindi was a rival of the Sultan of Mombasa, and the enemy of his enemy was, for the moment, his friend. It was at Malindi that da Gama obtained the thing he needed most desperately, a pilot who knew the monsoon winds of the Indian Ocean and could guide the fleet across to India. The identity of this pilot has been debated for 5 centuries. Portuguese sources call him a Moor or a Gujarati. Some later accounts, now largely discredited by serious historians, claimed he was the legendary Arab navigator Ahmad ibn Majid, author of navigational treatises that were encyclopedic in their knowledge of the Indian Ocean. Whoever he was, he knew what da Gama did not: the timing and direction of the monsoon winds that had carried trade across the Indian Ocean since before the birth of Christ. With this pilot aboard, da Gama's fleet left Malindi in late April 1498 and caught the tail end of the northeast monsoon. The crossing took 23 days. 23 days from the coast of Africa to the coast of India, riding winds that the Arab, Indian, Persian, and Chinese navigators had used for centuries and that the Portuguese were experiencing for the first time. After 11 months of sailing, after scurvy and storms and hostile ports and thousands of miles of open ocean, the fleet made landfall near Calicut on the Malabar coast of southwestern India on the 20th of May, 1498. Calicut was not what da Gama expected, because what da Gama expected was shaped by decades of Portuguese wishful thinking. The prevailing theory in Lisbon, derived from fragmentary intelligence, confused geography, and a generous helping of fantasy, was that India was populated by Christians. Not Roman Catholics necessarily, but Christians of some ancient Eastern variety, or descendants perhaps of the converts made by the Apostle Thomas, who, according to tradition, had traveled to India in the 1st century. The Portuguese expected to find allies in faith, fellow Christians who would welcome European co-religionists and join in a grand alliance against the Islamic powers that separated them. What da Gama found instead was a sophisticated Hindu kingdom ruled by a monarch the Portuguese called the Zamorin, a title derived from the Malayalam word Samudiri, meaning Lord of the Sea. Calicut was one of the great trading ports of the Indian Ocean world, a city where Muslim merchants from Arabia and East Africa, Hindu traders from across the subcontinent, and occasional visitors from as far as China conducted business on a scale that made European commerce look provincial. The pepper that Europeans craved, the commodity that had drawn Portugal halfway around the world, was sold openly in Calicut's markets in quantities that staggered the Portuguese visitors. Gaspar Correa recorded that the warehouses of Calicut held more pepper in a single building than Lisbon imported in an entire year. Da Gama was received by the Zamorin with a combination of curiosity and condescension that the Portuguese captain found intolerable. The audience was grand. Da Gama was carried through the streets on a palanquin. The court was rich, the palace crowded with attendants. But when da Gama presented his trade goods, the reaction was devastating. The Zamorin's merchants examined the striped cloth, the coral beads, the honey and sugar, and declared them unfit for the Calicut market. These were goods suitable for trade in West Africa, perhaps. In India, and they were an insult. The Muslim merchants in particular, who understood immediately that the Portuguese represented a direct threat to their control of the spice trade, worked to undermine da Gama at every turn, advising the Zamorin that these newcomers were pirates, not traders, and that their goods proved they had nothing to offer. Da Gama spent approximately 3 months in and around Calicut, growing increasingly frustrated. He managed to purchase small quantities of pepper and cinnamon, but the terms were unfavorable and the quantities insignificant. He was alternately hosted and detained by the Zamorin, whose attitude shifted between interest and suspicion depending on which advisors had his ear. Da Gama's temper, never far from the surface, erupted repeatedly. He seized hostages. He threatened bombardment. He departed Calicut in August 1498 with a cargo hold that contained enough spices to prove the route was viable, but nothing close to the fortune Manuel had envisioned. The return voyage was a nightmare. Da Gama chose to sail back across the Indian Ocean against the monsoon rather than wait months for the winds to reverse. It was a decision driven by impatience rather than seamanship, and it nearly killed everyone. The crossing that had taken 23 days eastbound took nearly 3 months westbound. Scurvy ravaged the crews. Men died in such numbers that Da Gama was forced to burn the São Rafael because he no longer had enough healthy sailors to crew 3 ships. The survivors, who staggered back into Lisbon harbor in September 1499, more than 2 years after their departure, were skeletal, scarred, and diminished. Of the approximately 170 men who had sailed, only 54 returned alive. But they had done it. They had sailed to India and back. They had proved that the sea route existed, that it was navigable, and that the spice markets of the East could be reached by any nation with the ships and the nerve to make the journey. The samples of pepper and cinnamon that Da Gama brought back, modest though they were, sold in Lisbon for 60 times what the expedition had cost. The mathematics of the spice trade, even in this diminished trial run, were staggering. Manuel immediately understood what he had. He adopted a new title, one of the most magnificent and absurd in the history of European monarchy. He declared himself Lord of the Conquest, Navigation, and Commerce of Ethiopia, Arabia, Persia, and India. He had conquered nothing. He had navigated to India once at a cost of 2/3 of his men. He had conducted commerce so poorly that the merchants of Calicut had laughed at his offerings. But the title was not a description of present reality. It was a declaration of intent. Portugal moved fast, faster than any European power had ever mobilized for overseas expansion. Within months of Da Gama's return, Manuel ordered a second fleet assembled, this one vastly larger and more explicitly military in its composition. The days of 4 ships and 170 men were over. The Second India Fleet, which departed in March 1500 under the command of Pedro Alvarez Cabral, consisted of 13 ships carrying approximately 1,500 men, including soldiers, merchants, priests, and a contingent of experienced bombardiers to man the heavy cannon that were now mounted in every ship's hull. Cabral's fleet followed Da Gama's route into the South Atlantic but swung even further west during the Volta do Mar. On the 22nd of April 1500, the fleet made landfall on the coast of what is now Brazil. Whether this was accidental, as the official Portuguese account maintained, or deliberate, as many historians have argued, Cabral claimed the land for Portugal, dispatched a ship back to Lisbon with the news, and continued on his way to India. The largest territory in the Western Hemisphere had just been added to the Portuguese crown as an afterthought, a side effect of the real mission, which was pepper. Cabral rounded the Cape in terrible weather. 4 ships were lost in storms off southern Africa, including the vessel carrying Bartolomeu Dias, the man who had first rounded the Cape 12 years earlier. Dias drowned within sight of the waters he had opened to European navigation. The sea did not care about the symmetry, but the chroniclers noticed it. The surviving ships reached Calicut, where Cabral attempted to establish a permanent trading post. The Zamorin granted permission. Muslim merchants, understanding the existential threat this represented to their centuries-old monopoly, organized resistance. A mob attacked the Portuguese trading post, killing approximately 50 men, including several Franciscan friars. Cabral's response was immediate and devastating. He bombarded Calicut for 2 full days, burning much of the waterfront quarter and killing an unknown number of inhabitants, on a number that the Portuguese chroniclers did not bother to estimate because the Indian dead were not, in their accounting system, people whose numbers mattered. Cabral then sailed south to Cochin, a rival port whose ruler was happy to undercut the Zamorin by trading directly with the Portuguese. He loaded his remaining ships with pepper and cinnamon purchased at prices far more favorable than Da Gama had managed, and returned to Lisbon with a cargo whose value exceeded every expectation. The commercial case was now proven beyond argument. The sea route to India was not merely possible, it was profitable on a scale that could transform Portugal from the poorest kingdom in Western Europe into something unprecedented. And Manuel, sitting in his palace in Lisbon, reviewing Cabral's accounts and the reports of violence and resistance and diplomatic failure and enormous profit, understood that commerce alone would not be sufficient. The Indian Ocean was too large, the existing trading networks too entrenched, the hostile powers too numerous for Portugal to simply sail back and forth buying pepper. If Portugal wanted to control the spice trade, it would have to control the ocean itself. It would have to build fortresses, station permanent fleets, dominate the choke points through which all trade flowed. It would have to do what no nation in history had ever attempted. It would have to turn an entire ocean into a Portuguese lake. The man Manuel chose for this impossible task was perhaps the most consequential figure in the history of European imperialism. I mean, a figure far less famous than Columbus or Magellan, but far more important in shaping the world that followed. His name was Afonso de Albuquerque, and he would arrive in the Indian Ocean with a vision so ambitious and so ruthless that it would redraw the map of the world. But that transformation, the construction of a maritime empire spanning 3 oceans built by a nation with fewer people than a single modern city, is a story that requires understanding not just the will of kings and captains, but the machinery of violence and commerce that Portugal assembled piece by piece in the harbors and fortresses and killing grounds of the East. Afonso de Albuquerque arrived in the Indian Ocean in 1503, a 50-year-old fidalgo with a gray beard, a body hardened by decades of military service in North Africa, and a strategic vision that no one in Lisbon fully understood until it was already being executed in fire and blood 6,000 miles from home. He was not at first in command. The early Portuguese fleets to India operated under a rotating system of captains, each appointed for a single voyage, each with instructions that amounted to the same basic formula: sail to India, buy pepper, come home. It was a merchant strategy applied to a military problem, and Albuquerque recognized its fundamental inadequacy before he ever saw the Indian coast. Buying pepper in Calicut or Cochin and sailing home with it was profitable, certainly, but it did not give Portugal control. It made Portugal a customer, and one buyer among many in a market that had functioned for 1,000 years without European participation and would continue to function without it the moment the Portuguese ships sailed away. The Arab merchants, the Gujarati traders, the Egyptian middlemen, they were all still there. They still controlled the networks. They still had the relationships, the languages, the credit systems, the knowledge of local markets that the Portuguese lacked entirely. Every time a Portuguese fleet departed for Lisbon, the Indian Ocean reverted to the status quo as if the Europeans had never come. Albuquerque understood that Portugal could not compete on commercial terms. It was too small, too poor, too far from the centers of Indian Ocean trade. A single Gujarati merchant house had more capital than the entire Portuguese crown. The trading cities of the Malabar coast had been conducting sophisticated international commerce for centuries before Portugal existed as a nation. In any fair commercial competition, Portugal would be a minor player at best, tolerated as long as it was useful, ignored or expelled the moment it became inconvenient. But Portugal had one advantage that no Indian Ocean power could match. It had cannon. The military revolution that transformed European warfare in the 15th century had produced, by the 1490s, shipboard artillery of devastating effectiveness. Portuguese naus and caravels carried heavy bronze cannon capable of firing stone or iron balls at ranges that no Indian Ocean vessel could match. The ships of the Indian Ocean, Arab dhows, Gujarati merchant vessels, Chinese junks, Malay proas, were designed for trade, not for naval warfare as Europeans understood it. They carried fighters, certainly. Boarding actions and close quarters combat were common, but they did not carry the kind of heavy, hull-smashing cannon that could sink an enemy ship from half a mile away without ever closing to boarding range. This was not because Indian Ocean civilizations were technologically primitive. It was because their maritime traditions had evolved in a different direction toward speed, cargo capacity, and navigational efficiency, rather than toward the floating artillery platforms that European naval architects were producing in response to centuries of Mediterranean and Atlantic naval warfare. Albuquerque saw this asymmetry clearly, and he saw what it meant. Portugal could not outbuy the Indian Ocean merchants. It could not outman them. It was certainly not with the tiny crews that the long voyage from Lisbon required. It could not outlast them, not at the end of a supply line that stretched halfway around the world, but it could outgun them. And if it could outgun them at sea, it could control the sea. And if it controlled the sea, it controlled everything that moved on the sea. Every cargo of pepper, every bale of silk, every chest of gold, every ship carrying anything of value across the Indian Ocean would move only with Portuguese permission or not at all. This was the strategic insight that made Albuquerque the architect of the first global empire. Not conquest of territory, not colonization of populations, control of movement, control of choke points, control of the narrow straits and key harbors through which the trade of the entire Eastern world was forced to pass. He identified 3 choke points, 3 gates through which the wealth of Asia flowed, and which, if locked, would give Portugal effective sovereignty over the richest trade routes on earth. The first was Hormuz, the island fortress commanding the entrance to the Persian Gulf, through which the trade between India and Persia and Mesopotamia passed. The second was Aden, or failing Aden, some point of control at the mouth of the Red Sea, through which the trade between India and Egypt and the Mediterranean passed. This was the jugular of the Venetian spice monopoly. If Portugal controlled the Red Sea entrance, Venice starved. The third was Malacca, the great trading port on the strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, through which virtually all trade between the Indian Ocean and the markets of China, Japan, and the Spice Islands was funneled. Control those 3 points, Albuquerque argued, and Portugal would control the commerce of half the world, not by occupying vast territories, not by governing millions of people, not by building the kind of sprawling land empire that had bankrupted every European power that attempted it, but by holding the gates and taxing everything that passed through them. It was an empire of nodes rather than surfaces, a network rather than a territory. And it was perfectly suited to a nation that had the ships and the guns but not the manpower to do anything more. Albuquerque was appointed governor of Portuguese India in 1509, succeeding the first viceroy, Francisco de Almeida, after a power struggle so bitter that Albuquerque spent several months in chains aboard his own ship before royal orders from Lisbon confirmed his authority. Almeida had pursued a different strategy, one based on naval dominance through roving fleets rather than permanent fortifications. He had won the decisive Battle of Diu in February 1509, destroying a combined Egyptian Gujarati fleet in a naval engagement that demonstrated, with terrible finality, that no Indian Ocean power could match Portuguese firepower at sea. The Egyptian Sultan had assembled the fleet specifically to destroy the Portuguese intruders, equipping it with Venetian-supplied cannon and Venetian military advisors, because Venice understood as clearly as Portugal did that the sea route around Africa threatened the entire economic order that Venetian prosperity depended on. The fleet was annihilated. The Egyptian naval challenge to Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean was broken permanently in a single afternoon. When the smoke cleared and the wreckage stopped burning, there was no force in the Indian Ocean capable of meeting the Portuguese in open naval combat. Albuquerque inherited this naval supremacy and immediately set about converting it into permanent territorial control. His first target was Goa. Goa was not one of his 3 strategic choke points. It was something equally important, a base. The Portuguese had been operating in the Indian Ocean from Cochin, a friendly port on the Malabar coast whose ruler provided facilities in exchange for Portuguese military support against his rivals. But Cochin was someone else's city. The Portuguese were there by permission, and permission could be revoked. Albuquerque wanted a city that belonged to Portugal outright, a fortified naval base from which fleets could be dispatched, repaired, provisioned, and reinforced without depending on any local ruler's goodwill. Goa sat on an island at the mouth of the Mandovi River, on the coast of what is now the Indian state of the same name. It was governed by the Sultanate of Bijapur, one of the successor states of the crumbling Bahmani Sultanate. The city was wealthy, strategically located, and, in the early months of 1510, weakly garrisoned. Albuquerque struck in March. The initial assault took the city with relative ease, but holding it proved far more difficult. The Sultan of Bijapur counterattacked with a force that vastly outnumbered the Portuguese garrison. Albuquerque was driven out, forced to retreat to his ships, and spent 3 months anchored in the river mouth, his forces decimated by disease and desertion, his officers openly questioning his judgment. Several captains advocated abandoning the enterprise entirely and returning to Cochin. Albuquerque refused. He waited for the monsoon rains to end, for the Bijapuri forces to weaken and disperse, and then attacked again in November 1510 with every ship and every man he could muster. The second assault on Goa was one of the most violent episodes in the history of Portuguese expansion, and that is a history with no shortage of violence. Albuquerque's forces stormed the city and spent 3 days in systematic slaughter. The Muslim population, men, women, and children, was massacred without distinction. Gaspar Correa, who was not a man given to sentimentality, described streets running with blood and bodies stacked against walls. Albuquerque ordered the killing explicitly. His stated rationale, preserved in his own letters to King Manuel, was strategic. He wanted to terrify every Muslim ruler in the Indian Ocean into understanding that resistance to Portuguese power would be met with annihilation. He wanted the fall of Goa to echo across the ocean, and it did. For generations afterward, the name Albuquerque was spoken in the ports of the Indian Ocean with the kind of fear usually reserved for natural disasters. Goa became the capital of Portuguese India, near the Estado de India, and it would remain so for 451 years until the Indian Army took it by force in 1961. Albuquerque immediately began fortifying the city, building the massive stone walls and bastions that would make it nearly impregnable from the sea, establishing shipyards capable of building and repairing ocean-going vessels, creating the administrative infrastructure of a permanent colonial government. He also, in a policy that was radical for its time, encouraged Portuguese soldiers to marry local women, specifically Hindu women who converted to Christianity. The mixed-race families that resulted would form the nucleus of a Luso-Indian community that persisted for centuries. Albuquerque understood, perhaps more clearly than any of his contemporaries, that an empire maintained by a nation of 1 million people could not be sustained by a constant flow of reinforcements from Lisbon. It would have to reproduce itself locally, creating populations with personal stakes in the survival of Portuguese power. With Goa secured as his base, Albuquerque turned to Malacca. Malacca was the cork in the bottle of East Asian trade. Situated on the strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, the city controlled the narrowest point of the sea passage connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea and the Pacific beyond. Everything that moved between India and China passed through this strait. Silk, porcelain, tea, and silver flowed westward. Cotton, pepper, opium, and incense flowed eastward. Malacca itself was one of the most cosmopolitan cities on earth, a port where Gujarati merchants, Tamil traders, Javanese sailors, Chinese junks, Thai emissaries, and Ryukyuan vessels from Okinawa might all be found in the harbor on any given day. Tomé Pires, the Portuguese apothecary who visited Malacca shortly after its conquest, claimed that 84 languages could be heard in its streets and that more ships anchored in its harbor than in any other port in the world. The Sultan of Malacca was a Muslim ruler who controlled the strait through a combination of naval power, diplomatic relationships, and the sheer gravitational pull of Malacca's market. He had received earlier Portuguese embassies with suspicion that proved well-founded. In 1509, a Portuguese delegation had been arrested and several of its members killed. Albuquerque used this incident as his casus belli, though he would have attacked Malacca regardless. The strait was the second of his 3 gates, and he intended to lock it. The assault on Malacca came in July 1511, and it was a masterpiece of the kind of violence that Albuquerque had perfected. He had approximately 900 Portuguese soldiers and 200 Indian auxiliaries. The defenders numbered in the tens of thousands. The odds were absurd by any conventional military calculation, but Albuquerque had cannon. He had ships that could deliver devastating broadsides to the waterfront defenses, and he had a tactical ruthlessness that the defenders could not match. The battle lasted several days of savage fighting. The Portuguese attacked from the sea, using their ships' guns to suppress the defenders along the waterfront, then landed assault parties that fought street by street through the city. The bridge over the river that divided Malacca became the scene of particularly ferocious combat, with Portuguese soldiers and Malay warriors fighting hand-to-hand in a space so narrow that only a few men could engage at once. Albuquerque personally directed the assault, positioning himself at the point of maximum danger with a disregard for his own safety that his officers found either inspiring or insane depending on their temperament. The Sultan fled. His treasury, including a legendary collection of gold and jewels, was captured largely intact. Albuquerque immediately ordered the construction of a fortress, the famous A Famosa, built with stone torn from the Sultan's own mosque and palace, a gesture of deliberate symbolic violence. He established a Portuguese garrison, appointed a governor, and set about converting Malacca from an independent trading city into a Portuguese stronghold controlling access to the richest trade routes in Asia. The fall of Malacca sent shockwaves across the Eastern world. The rulers of Siam, Java, and the Spice Islands sent embassies to the Portuguese, some seeking alliance, others seeking to understand the nature of this new power that had materialized from the Western Ocean and seized one of the most important cities in Asia with fewer than 1,000 men. Chinese merchants in Malacca, whose community had been well established for generations, quickly reached accommodation with the Portuguese. They understood power, and they understood commerce, and they could see that the Portuguese, whatever else they were, represented a force that could be traded with, the Gujarati merchants, whose community had been the wealthiest in Malacca before the conquest, were treated far less gently. Many were killed during the assault, others were expelled. Their warehouses and trading houses were confiscated. Albuquerque had little use for Muslim merchants in his new possession. They were competitors, and he intended to eliminate competition. From Malacca, Albuquerque dispatched expeditions further east. A small fleet under Antonio de Abreu sailed to the Moluccas, the fabled Spice Islands, reaching Banda and Ambon in early 1512. These tiny volcanic islands in what is now eastern Indonesia were the only places on Earth where nutmeg and cloves grew naturally. They were the ultimate source, the geological accident that had generated the entire spice trade, the point of origin for the chain of commerce that stretched from the volcanic soil of the Moluccas through Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, up the Red Sea, across Egypt, and into the counting houses of Venice. Portuguese ships were now anchored at both ends of that chain, the middlemen, the entire vast network of intermediaries who had marked up the price of a handful of cloves by a factor of 1,000 between the tree and the European table, could be bypassed entirely. The third choke point, Hormuz, Albuquerque had actually attacked first in 1507 before he held the governorship. That initial assault had failed, undone by the resistance of his own captains, who considered the enterprise suicidal, and by the formidable defenses of the island fortress that commanded the entrance to the Persian Gulf. He returned in 1515, even with more ships and fewer officers willing to question his orders, and this time he succeeded. Hormuz fell after a siege that demonstrated again the decisive advantage of Portuguese naval gunnery against fortifications designed to resist an earlier era of warfare. Albuquerque built a fortress on the island, garrisoned it with Portuguese soldiers, and established a customs house that would levy duties on every vessel entering or leaving the Persian Gulf. The 3 gates were locked. Hormuz controlled the Persian Gulf. Goa provided the central base. Malacca controlled the passage to the Far East, and the Portuguese navy patrolling the waters between these fixed points enforced a system that was breathtaking in its ambition and savage in its execution. The system was called the Cartaz. It was, in essence, a protection racket elevated to the level of imperial policy. Every merchant vessel operating in the Indian Ocean was required to carry a Cartaz, a pass issued by Portuguese authorities specifying what cargo the vessel could carry, what ports it could visit, and what duties it must pay. Vessels caught without a Cartaz were subject to seizure. Their cargo was confiscated. Their crews were imprisoned or killed. The ships themselves were burned. This was not a law of the sea recognized by any international authority. It was a unilateral assertion of sovereignty over an ocean that had been freely navigated for millennia. No Indian, Arab, Persian, or Southeast Asian ruler had ever claimed the right to control who sailed the Indian Ocean. The sea had been in the legal and practical understanding of every civilization that bordered it, open to all. The Portuguese changed this. They declared the Indian Ocean a Portuguese sea, the mare clausum, and they enforced the declaration with cannon. The enforcement was not perfect. The Indian Ocean was too vast, the Portuguese too few, the merchant vessels too numerous for every ship to be inspected and every route to be patrolled. Smuggling flourished. Ships sailed without cartazes and took their chances. Some were caught and destroyed, most were not. But the system did not need to be perfect to be effective. It needed only to be sufficiently terrifying that the majority of merchants calculated it was cheaper to buy the cartaz than to risk sailing without one. And for most merchants, most of the time, that calculation held. The revenues from cartaz fees, combined with the customs duties levied at Portuguese-controlled ports, each generated an income stream that, at its peak, rivaled the revenues of the Portuguese crown itself. Albuquerque did not live to see the full flowering of the system he designed. He died on the 16th of December 1515 aboard his ship in the harbor of Goa, returning from his conquest of Hormuz. He was 62 years old. He had spent the last 6 years of his life in almost continuous military campaigning, and his health had been deteriorating for months. His final days were embittered by the knowledge that enemies at court in Lisbon had undermined his position, and that King Manuel had appointed a replacement governor before news of the Hormuz victory reached Portugal. Gaspar Correa recorded that Albuquerque, upon receiving the letter informing him of his dismissal, said that he was in bad standing with the king for the love of men, and in bad standing with men for the love of the king. He dictated a final letter to Manuel and died before it could be sent. He left behind an empire unlike anything the world had seen. It was not an empire of territory in the traditional sense. Portugal did not govern India. It did not administer Malacca's hinterland. It did not occupy the Spice Islands. It controlled a chain of fortified points, connected by sea lanes patrolled by armed ships, extracting wealth not through the governance of populations, but through the taxation of movement. It was an empire of perhaps 6,000 Portuguese men scattered across dozens of fortresses from Sofala in East Africa to Ternate in the Moluccas, a distance of more than 10,000 miles, controlling trade worth more than the entire gross domestic product of most European kingdoms. The human cost of this system was enormous, and it was borne overwhelmingly by the peoples of the Indian Ocean world. Portuguese violence was not incidental to the empire, it was structural. The cartaz system functioned only because refusal meant destruction. The fortresses existed because the local populations had not consented to Portuguese control and would expel the garrisons the moment they perceived weakness. Every Portuguese fortress in the Indian Ocean was a foreign intrusion maintained by force in a region where the inhabitants had not asked for Portuguese presence and did not benefit from it. The massacres at Goa and Malacca were not aberrations, they were policy. Albuquerque and his successors used exemplary violence, the deliberate infliction of spectacular cruelty against selected targets, as a tool of imperial control. His ships captured without cartazes were not merely seized. Their crews were sometimes mutilated, hands and ears cut off, and sent back to port as warnings. Coastal towns that resisted Portuguese demands were bombarded and burned. The calculus was explicit in Portuguese correspondence. A small nation controlling a vast ocean needed its enemies to believe that the cost of resistance would always exceed the cost of compliance. This was the machinery of empire that Portugal built in the first 2 decades of the 16th century. It was ingenious. It was profitable. And it was, by any moral standard that acknowledges the humanity of non-European peoples, a system of organized robbery enforced by terrorism. The chroniclers recorded both dimensions because both dimensions were equally real, And anyone who tells this story without holding both in mind simultaneously is not telling the story at all. But even as Albuquerque's system reached its maximum effectiveness, the very smallness that had made Portugal's strategy necessary was beginning to reveal itself as a limitation that no amount of strategic brilliance could overcome. 1 million people? That was still the population from which every sailor, every soldier, every governor, every priest, every carpenter and cooper and cannoneer had to be drawn. Every man who sailed for India was a man who would not farm Portuguese soil, would not work in a Portuguese workshop, would not father children who grew up speaking Portuguese in Portugal. The demographic mathematics were brutal, and they were inescapable. And they were already beginning to erode the foundations of everything Albuquerque had built. The ships that sailed from Lisbon each spring, the great India fleets that departed with banners flying and cannons saluting and crowds weeping on the banks of the Tagus, were bleeding Portugal dry, and the bleeding was slow enough that for decades it was mistaken for health. Consider the numbers. Each year's India fleet required between 2,000 and 4,000 men to crew the ships, man the guns, and reinforce the garrisons strung across the Indian Ocean. These were not numbers that a nation of 1 million people could sustain indefinitely. Portugal's total population in the early 16th century was roughly equivalent to that of a single major European city. Paris had more inhabitants. So did Naples, Constantinople, and Cairo. The entire kingdom from the Minho River in the north to the Algarve coast in the south could not muster the population of modern-day San Jose, California, and from this slender human reservoir the crown was drawing thousands of men every year and sending them to the other side of the world. The mortality rates were staggering. Of the men who sailed for India in any given year, a significant percentage never returned. The voyage itself killed many. The route around the Cape of Good Hope, even after decades of experience had refined the navigation, remained one of the most dangerous sea passages on Earth. Ships foundered in storms off southern Africa. Scurvy claimed crews with a regularity that the Portuguese came to accept as the unavoidable cost of empire. The crossing from Lisbon to Goa took 5 to 7 months under favorable conditions, and conditions were frequently not favorable. Ships that missed the monsoon window or encountered contrary weather could spend 9 months at sea, by which time their provisions were exhausted and their crews were dying at a rate of several men per week. Those who survived the voyage faced dangers of a different kind. Tropical diseases, malaria, dysentery, cholera, typhus killed Portuguese soldiers and sailors at rates that dwarfed combat losses. The garrison at Mozambique was so notoriously unhealthy that assignment there was regarded as a death sentence. Goa itself, the glittering capital of the Estado de India, was surrounded by malarial swamps that thinned the European population every monsoon season. The Portuguese never developed effective treatments for tropical diseases, and they never acclimated to the climate. Each generation of arrivals sickened and died at roughly the same rate as the generation before, creating a permanent demand for replacements that could only be met by stripping more young men from the fields and workshops of Portugal. Combat losses, while smaller in absolute numbers than disease mortality, were constant. The Portuguese Empire in the Indian Ocean was never at peace. There was always a siege to maintain, a rebellion to suppress, a rival fleet to engage, a fortress under attack somewhere along the 10,000-mile chain of possessions. The garrisons were perpetually undermanned. A fortress that required 300 soldiers to defend adequately might have 150 or 80 or fewer. The governors wrote desperate letters to Lisbon begging for reinforcements that arrived late, or in insufficient numbers, or not at all. And then there was desertion. This is the factor that Portuguese imperial historians least like to discuss, but it was arguably the most corrosive of all. Thousands of Portuguese men, having arrived in the Indian Ocean and discovered that the fortunes promised to them were illusory, that garrison life was brutal, that the pay was inadequate, and frequently months or years in arrears, simply walked away. They disappeared into the interior of India or the islands of Southeast Asia. They married local women, adopted local customs, learned local languages, and lived out their lives as renegades, traders, mercenaries, and adventurers operating entirely outside Portuguese authority. Some converted to Islam. Some became pirates. Some offered their military expertise, particularly their knowledge of European firearms and fortification techniques, to the very rulers the Portuguese were fighting against. These men, the degradados, and lançados and caçados who inhabited the margins of the Portuguese Empire, were a permanent embarrassment to Lisbon and a permanent source of military intelligence for Portugal's enemies. Every renegade Portuguese gunner who taught an Indian prince how to cast cannon, every deserter who showed a Malay sultan how to design a bastion that could withstand Portuguese bombardment, eroded the technological advantage that was the foundation of Portugal's imperial power, and there was nothing the governors could do about it. They could not patrol the interior of India. They could not prevent individual men from slipping away in the night. They could not offer sufficient inducements to compete with the attractions of a continent where a European with military skills could live like a king. The demographic hemorrhage was compounded by a phenomenon that modern economists would recognize as the resource curse. The wealth flowing back from the Indian Ocean, the pepper and cinnamon and silk and porcelain, the customs revenues and cartaz fees and outright plunder, enriched the Portuguese crown and a small circle of court favorites, but did remarkably little for the Portuguese economy as a whole. King Manuel spent lavishly. He built the Jerónimos Monastery in Lisbon, a masterpiece of Manueline Gothic architecture funded directly by the pepper trade. He maintained a court of extraordinary magnificence. He sent embassies to Rome bearing gifts of Indian elephants and rhinoceroses that dazzled the papal court, and announced to all of Europe that Portugal had achieved something unprecedented. But the spice wealth was not invested in Portuguese agriculture, which remained backward. It was not invested in Portuguese manufacturing, which remained negligible. It was not invested in Portuguese infrastructure, which remained medieval. The pepper arrived in Lisbon, was sold to European distributors, and the revenue was consumed by the crown, by the church, by the nobility, and by the escalating cost of maintaining the Indian Ocean Empire itself. Portugal became a pipeline through which Asian wealth flowed to European markets, and the pipeline itself grew no richer for the passage. The country that was conquering half the world was simultaneously failing to develop the domestic economy that might have sustained the conquest. Meanwhile, the social consequences of the overseas enterprise were transforming Portugal in ways that would not be fully understood for generations. The men who left were predominantly young, predominantly from the laboring classes, and predominantly unmarried. They were exactly the demographic that a pre-modern agrarian economy could least afford to lose. Fields went unplowed, workshops lost apprentices, villages in the Alentejo and the Minho, the regions that provided the bulk of the overseas manpower, reported to the crown that there were not enough hands to bring in the harvest. Women outnumbered men in many communities by ratios that distorted social life, marriage patterns, and economic productivity. The Portuguese historian Vitorino Magalhães Godinho estimated that Portugal lost approximately 10,000 people per year to overseas enterprises during the peak decades of the 16th century. Not all of these were deaths. Many were permanent emigrations, men who went to India or Brazil and never came back, whether because they died, deserted, settled, or simply could not afford the return voyage. But the effect on Portugal's demographic base was the same: 10,000 people per year from a population of 1 to 1.5 million. That is roughly equivalent, in proportional terms, to the United States losing 2 million people annually, every year, for decades, without replacement. It was a rate of depletion that could not be sustained. And everyone who thought carefully about it knew that it could not be sustained. But the profits were too enormous, the prestige too intoxicating, the institutional momentum too powerful, and the alternatives too unappealing for anyone to seriously propose stopping. Portugal was trapped in the logic of its own success. The empire required constant reinforcement. The reinforcement required men. The men came from a population that was shrinking because of the empire. It was a spiral, and it was tightening. Yet even as the spiral tightened, the empire continued to expand. The decades following Albuquerque's death in 1515 saw Portuguese reach extend to territories and peoples that even the great governor had never imagined engaging. The momentum he had set in motion carried Portuguese ships, traders, missionaries, and adventurers to the furthest corners of the known world and beyond its edges into regions that no European had ever seen or even reliably heard of. The push eastward from Malacca brought the Portuguese into contact with the oldest and most sophisticated civilization they had yet encountered. China under the Ming dynasty was a continental empire of perhaps 150 million people, governed by a bureaucracy of Confucian scholars, defended by armies that dwarfed anything Europe could field, and possessed of a cultural self-confidence so total that the arrival of a few Portuguese ships was regarded as an event of approximately the same significance as the appearance of a previously unknown species of tropical bird. Interesting, perhaps, worthy of a footnote, certainly not a cause for alarm. The first Portuguese ships reached the southern Chinese coast in 1513. Tomé Pires, the apothecary turned diplomat whose Summa Oriental would become the primary European source for understanding Asian trade networks, was dispatched as ambassador to the Ming court in 1517. The embassy was a disaster. The Portuguese had acquired a reputation in the South China Sea that preceded them, and it was not a flattering one. Reports of Portuguese violence at Malacca, of piracy against Chinese merchant vessels, and of slave trading along the Southeast Asian coast had reached Canton through the very trade networks the Portuguese were attempting to penetrate. The Chinese authorities were further offended by the Portuguese practice of firing cannon salutes upon entering port, which they interpreted not as a naval courtesy but as an act of military intimidation. Pires was eventually imprisoned in Canton, where he spent years in captivity before dying in obscurity. Several members of his embassy were executed. The failure of the Pires embassy demonstrated something that the Portuguese had not yet been forced to confront. Their model of empire, built on naval gunnery, fortified trading posts, and the Cartaz system of enforced passes, worked against the fragmented polities of the Indian Ocean Rim, the small sultanates, the competing city-states, the kingdoms too divided by internal rivalries to mount a coordinated response. It did not work against a unified continental empire with the resources and the political will to simply refuse Portuguese demands. China could not be intimidated by a few cannon. It could not be divided by playing one faction against another. It could not be conquered or coerced. It could only be negotiated with on terms that China set. The Portuguese eventually established a foothold in China, but it came through accommodation, not force. In 1557, by a process that remains historically murky, the Portuguese were granted permission to establish a permanent settlement at Macau, a small peninsula on the southern coast near Canton. The circumstances of this grant were debated even at the time. Portuguese accounts claimed it was a reward for helping suppress piracy in the region. Chinese accounts suggested it was a pragmatic concession to manage a foreign presence that was going to exist regardless. Whatever the reason, Macau became the Portuguese gateway to China, a tiny enclave where East Asian and European commerce intersected and where fortunes were made in the silk and silver trade that connected China to Japan through Portuguese intermediaries. Japan. The encounter with Japan is perhaps the most remarkable chapter in the entire Portuguese expansion, because it was the one place where the Portuguese arrived not as conquerors, but as something closer to guests, and where their most lasting impact came not from cannon, but from an object far smaller and far more transformative. In 1543, a group of Portuguese traders aboard a Chinese junk were blown off course by a typhoon and made landfall on the island of Tanegashima, off the southern tip of Kyushu. They were the first Europeans to reach Japan. The Japanese, who were in the midst of the Sengoku period, in an era of civil war that had fragmented the archipelago into dozens of competing domains ruled by feudal lords called daimyo, received the newcomers with a combination of fascination and shrewd calculation that was characteristic of Japanese engagement with the outside world. The Portuguese had brought firearms. Specifically, they had brought matchlock arquebuses, The standard infantry weapon of European armies in the mid-16th century, the Japanese examined these weapons with the attention of a people for whom warfare was not an occasional necessity but a constant daily reality. Within a year, Japanese swordsmiths, applying metallurgical skills that had been refined over centuries of katana production, were manufacturing their own firearms. Within a decade, Japan possessed more guns than any other country on Earth. The Portuguese had not conquered Japan, they had armed it. The trade that developed between Portugal and Japan was unlike anything the Portuguese conducted elsewhere. The Portuguese became intermediaries in the Sino-Japanese trade, carrying Chinese silk to Japan and Japanese silver to China, a service that both civilizations valued because direct trade between China and Japan had been disrupted by piracy and political hostility. The Portuguese ships that made the annual voyage from Goa to Macau to Nagasaki carried cargoes of extraordinary value, and the profits on a single successful voyage could equal the annual revenues of a mid-sized European state. The Nao do Trado, the Great Black Ship as the Japanese called it, became an institution, and the port of Nagasaki, which developed around the Portuguese trade, grew from a fishing village into one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Japan. The Portuguese also brought something to Japan that would prove more disruptive than firearms and more enduring than the silk trade. They brought Jesuit missionaries. Francis Xavier, the Navarrese co-founder of the Society of Jesus, arrived in Japan in 1549 and spent 2 years preaching, converting, and laying the groundwork for a Christian community that would grow to perhaps 300,000 adherents by the end of the century. The Jesuits were not casual proselytizers. They were the intellectual elite of the Catholic world, rigorously educated, linguistically gifted, and possessed of an adaptability that allowed them to operate in cultural environments that would have bewildered other Europeans. In Japan, they learned the language, studied the culture, adapted their message to Japanese philosophical frameworks, and built a network of churches, schools, and seminaries that represented the most ambitious Catholic missionary enterprise in Asia. The relationship between the Jesuit mission and Portuguese commerce was intimate and deliberate. The Jesuits depended on Portuguese trade for their financial support. The Portuguese traders depended on the Jesuits for their cultural mediation with Japanese society, and both depended on the goodwill of Japanese daimyo, who tolerated Christianity largely because it came packaged with Portuguese trade goods and Portuguese military technology. This entanglement of commerce, religion, and diplomacy was characteristic of Portuguese expansion everywhere, but in Japan it reached its most sophisticated expression. It would also, in time, reach its most devastating conclusion. But that reckoning lay decades in the future. And in the mid-16th century, the Portuguese position in East Asia seemed, from the vantage point of Lisbon, to be one of the great triumphs of the age. The same decades that saw Portugal reach China, and Japan also saw the consolidation of what would become, in terms of sheer territorial extent, the largest component of the Portuguese Empire. Brazil. The vast South American territory that Cabral had claimed almost accidentally in 1500 had initially been a disappointment. It contained no spices. Its indigenous population, while numerous, was dispersed in small communities through the interior of an immense rainforest and showed no inclination toward the kind of centralized commerce that the Portuguese could tap into. There were no cities to conquer, no treasuries to seize, no established trade networks to co-opt. The Tupi and Guarani peoples who inhabited the coastal regions lived in ways that the Portuguese, applying the intellectual frameworks of their time, categorized as primitive, a judgment that reflected European ignorance of indigenous knowledge systems far more than it reflected the actual sophistication of these cultures. For the first 3 decades after its discovery, Brazil was essentially neglected. The crown was consumed by the far more lucrative Indian Ocean enterprise, and could spare little attention or resources for a territory whose only known export was Brazil wood, a tropical hardwood that produced a red dye valued by European textile manufacturers, but that generated nothing like the profits of the spice trade. Small parties of Portuguese traders established scattered posts along the coast, cutting Brazil wood and trading metal goods and trinkets with indigenous communities in exchange for labor and forest products. It was a marginal enterprise conducted by men who could not find better opportunities elsewhere, and it left almost no institutional footprint. This changed in the 1530s when the Portuguese crown, alarmed by French incursions along the Brazilian coast, realized that a territory left unoccupied would eventually be claimed by someone else. King João III, facing the twin pressures of defending his Indian Ocean empire and securing his American territory, adopted a solution that was characteristically Portuguese in its combination of ambition and parsimony. He divided the Brazilian coast into 15 captaincies, named strips of land extending from the coast deep into the unmapped interior, and granted each to a donatario, a private individual who was given virtually feudal authority over his captaincy in exchange for the obligation to colonize and develop it at his own expense. The system was, by almost any measure, a failure. Most of the donatarios lacked the resources to establish viable colonies. Several never even visited their captaincies. Those who did often found themselves overwhelmed by the hostility of the indigenous population, the disease environment of the tropical coast, and the sheer logistical impossibility of imposing European agricultural practices on a landscape that bore no resemblance to anything in their experience. Of the 15 original captaincies, only 2, Pernambuco in the northeast and São Vicente in the south, have achieved any lasting success. But the captaincy system planted the seeds of something that would eventually transform Brazil and with it the entire Atlantic world. The donatarios who succeeded did so by discovering that the Brazilian coastal lowlands, particularly in the northeast, were extraordinarily well suited to the cultivation of sugarcane. Sugar was the petroleum of the 16th century, a commodity for which European demand was insatiable and which commanded prices that made even the spice trade look modest by comparison. A single arroba of Brazilian sugar sold in Lisbon for more than the annual wages of a Portuguese laborer. The mathematics were irresistible. But sugar cultivation was labor-intensive to a degree that no other agricultural commodity could match. The cane had to be planted, tended, cut, and transported to the mill, crushed, boiled, clarified, and dried, a process that demanded enormous quantities of human labor applied under conditions of extreme physical brutality. The work was dangerous. The hours were punishing. The tropical heat was relentless, and the demand for workers vastly exceeded what Portuguese immigration could supply, even if Portugal had possessed the demographic surplus to spare, which it emphatically did not. The solution the Portuguese found was slavery. And with that solution, Portugal inaugurated the transatlantic slave trade, the largest forced migration in human history, an institution that would transport an estimated 12.5 million enslaved Africans to the Americas over the course of 4 centuries, and whose consequences continue to shape the societies of the Western Hemisphere to this day. The Portuguese had been trading in enslaved Africans since the 1440s. When the first captives were brought from the West African coast to the slave markets of Lagos in the Algarve. Henry the Navigator himself had blessed the enterprise and profited from it. For decades, the trade had been relatively small in scale, supplying domestic servants to Portuguese households, laborers to the sugar plantations of Madeira and São Tomé, and workers to various enterprises along the African coast. But the development of Brazilian sugar cultivation created a demand for enslaved labor on a scale that dwarfed everything that had come before. Portuguese slave traders, operating from fortified posts along the West African coast, particularly the fortress of São Jorge da Mina on the Gold Coast, and the stations in the Congo and Angola, began purchasing or capturing Africans in numbers that escalated decade by decade. The human beings who were torn from their communities marched to the coast and packed into the holds of slave ships for the Middle Passage across the Atlantic were not abstractions in a commercial system. They were individuals with names, families, skills, languages, religions, and futures that were stolen from them with a completeness that defies adequate description. The conditions of the Middle Passage were among the most horrific in the long catalog of human cruelty. Enslaved people were packed into the ship's lower decks in spaces so confined that they could not sit upright. They lay in their own waste for weeks. Diseases spread through the holds with devastating efficiency. Those who died were thrown overboard. Those who refused to eat were force-fed. Those who resisted were beaten, tortured, or killed as examples. The mortality rate on the crossing varied, but losing 10 to 20% of the human cargo was considered normal, and some voyages lost far more. On the Brazilian plantations, the enslaved Africans who survived the crossing were worked under conditions designed to extract maximum labor at minimum cost to the slave owner. Life expectancy on a sugar plantation was short, often measured in years rather than decades. The plantation owners calculated with the cold precision of men for whom human beings were entries in a ledger that it was cheaper to work enslaved people to death and purchase replacements than to provide conditions that might extend their lives. This calculation drove a perpetual demand for new slaves, which drove the expansion of the trade, which drove the further devastation of West African communities in a cycle that fed on itself for 300 years. Portugal did not invent slavery. Slavery existed in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, in every civilization that left records. But Portugal created the system that industrialized it. That turned the buying and selling and transporting and exploiting of human beings into a transatlantic commercial enterprise of staggering scale and efficiency. The Portuguese built the infrastructure, the coastal fortresses, the slave ships, the plantation system, the legal frameworks that classified human beings as property. And they did it because they needed labor that their tiny population could not provide for an agricultural enterprise that their imperial ambitions demanded, in a territory that their strategic calculations required them to hold. The moral catastrophe of the slave trade existed alongside and intertwined with every other dimension of Portuguese imperial achievement. The same ships that carried pepper from Goa carried enslaved Africans from Luanda. The same crown that funded Jesuit missions in Japan licensed slave trading posts in the Congo. The same navigational techniques that opened the sea route to India opened the Middle Passage to Brazil. There was no clean separation between the glory and the horror. They were the same enterprise, funded by the same treasury, executed by the same people, justified by the same theology that declared all of it: the exploration, the conquest, the conversion, and the enslavement, to be God's work carried out by God's chosen nation. By the middle of the 16th century, roughly 50 years after Vasco da Gama's first voyage, Portugal had assembled an empire that stretched across 4 continents and 3 oceans, an empire so vast that the sun literally never set on Portuguese possessions, a claim that would later be borrowed, with characteristic confidence, by the British. From Macau on the Pearl River Delta to the sugar mills of Pernambuco, from the cinnamon forests of Ceylon to the gold coast of Elmina, from the clove-scented islands of the Moluccas to the fortified harbor of Mozambique Island, the Portuguese flag flew over an arc of territory and influence that no single nation had ever claimed before, and that no nation of comparable size would ever claim again. But to look at a map of Portuguese possessions in 1550 and see an empire at its zenith is to mistake the outline for the substance. The map showed fortresses and trading posts and colonial settlements spread across the globe. What the map did not show was the thinness of the thread holding all of it together. The thread was human. It was always human. And by the middle of the century, it was fraying in ways that the architects of expansion had warned about, and the beneficiaries of expansion had chosen to ignore. The Estado da India, the formal administrative structure governing Portuguese possessions from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan, was by the 1540s and 1550s an institution in a state of permanent crisis that it had learned to disguise as normalcy. The governor in Goa presided, in theory, over a unified chain of command stretching from Sofala to Macau. In practice, communication alone made centralized governance a fantasy. A letter from Goa to Lisbon took 6 months to arrive under favorable conditions. The reply took another 6 months. A governor requesting guidance on a crisis would receive the king's response a full year after the crisis had either resolved itself or destroyed whatever it threatened. Governors learned to act on their own authority because they had no alternative, and the crown learned to tolerate independent action because it had no means of preventing it. The fortresses that formed the skeleton of the empire were, in many cases, crumbling. the stone walls that Albuquerque had built at Goa, and that his successors had raised at Diu, Chal, Beisain, Hormuz, Muscat, Colombo, and dozens of other locations, were designed to last. But they required maintenance that the garrisons frequently could not provide. Tropical heat, monsoon rains, and the salt air of coastal locations degraded mortar and stone with relentless efficiency. The wooden structures within the fortresses, the barracks and storehouses and hospitals, rotted and collapsed and were rebuilt with materials that were themselves already deteriorating. Governors wrote to Lisbon describing walls with gaps wide enough for a man to walk through, cannon mounted on carriages so decayed that firing them was as dangerous to the gunner as to the target, magazines where the powder had absorbed so much moisture from the tropical air that it would not ignite. The garrisons themselves were shadows of what they should have been. A fortress designed for 300 men might be held by 80. Of those 80, a third might be sick at any given time with malaria or dysentery. Another third might be so poorly equipped, lacking armor, lacking functional weapons, lacking adequate food, that their military effectiveness was marginal. The remaining third, the healthy and equipped core, was expected to defend the walls, patrol the surrounding waters, enforce the Cartaz system, maintain order among the local population, and project sufficient strength to deter any ruler who might be calculating whether the Portuguese could be expelled. The paradox was that this skeleton system worked after a fashion for far longer than it should have. It worked because the Indian Ocean world was politically fragmented. No single power had the motivation and the means to coordinate an assault on the Portuguese network as a whole. Individual fortresses were attacked, besieged, sometimes taken. The fortress at Chal was besieged by the Sultanate of Ahmadnagar. The fortress at Ternate in the Moluccas was eventually lost to a local sultan who had learned Portuguese military techniques from Portuguese deserters. Hormuz faced constant pressure from Persian ambitions, but these were local challenges, dealt with locally, and the network as a whole survived because no enemy could threaten all of it simultaneously. The system also worked because the Portuguese had become, despite themselves, indispensable to certain elements of the Indian Ocean economy. Local rulers who despised Portuguese arrogance nevertheless found Portuguese naval power useful against their own rivals. Merchants who resented the Cartaz system nevertheless preferred the predictability of Portuguese enforced sea lanes to the chaos of unpoliced waters where any pirate could intercept any cargo. The Portuguese had inserted themselves into the circulatory system of Indian Ocean commerce so thoroughly that removing them would have required disrupting trade networks that every participant depended on. It was a form of power that derived not from being loved or even respected, but from being necessary, or at least from being more trouble to remove than to tolerate. But toleration is not the same as permanence, and the forces that would eventually dismantle Portugal's Indian Ocean Empire were already gathering in the middle decades of the 16th century, even as the empire reached its greatest extent. The first and most fundamental force was demographic exhaustion, the slow bleeding that had begun with the very first India fleet and that accelerated with every passing decade. The historian Charles Boxer, whose work on the Portuguese Empire remains foundational, estimated that Portugal lost approximately 40,000 people to overseas enterprises during the reign of João III alone, from 1521 to 1557. Some of these losses were deaths, others were permanent emigrations, but the effect on Portuguese society was cumulative and increasingly visible. The Cortes, the Portuguese parliament, petitioned the crown repeatedly to limit overseas commitments. Clergy preached sermons lamenting the depopulation of the countryside. Chroniclers noted that Lisbon itself, while swollen with the wealth of the spice trade, was simultaneously drained of the young men who should have been its productive workforce. The crown's response to the manpower crisis was a series of expedients that solved immediate problems while creating long-term ones. And Portuguese garrisons were supplemented with locally recruited soldiers, Indian sepoys, African auxiliaries, mixed-race casados who owed their social position to Portuguese patronage. These forces were often effective in combat and essential to maintaining the empire's military capacity, but they also diluted the Portuguese character of the garrisons, created divided loyalties, and made the fortresses dependent on the continued willingness of local populations to serve a foreign power. When that willingness wavered, as it inevitably did during periods of Portuguese weakness, the garrisons discovered how thin the veneer of control actually was. The second force was corruption, and it was eating the empire from within. The vast distances, the slow communications, the inadequate salaries, and the staggering wealth flowing through Portuguese hands created conditions in which corruption was not an aberration, but a rational economic strategy for every individual in the system. Governors enriched themselves by diverting crown revenues to private trade. Captains of fortresses sold cartazes at inflated prices and pocketed the difference. Soldiers supplemented their meager pay by engaging in unauthorized commerce, sometimes in partnership with the very merchants they were supposed to be taxing. Ships' officers loaded crown vessels with private cargo, reducing the space available for official trade goods and the crown's revenue in the process. The corruption was so pervasive that it became structurally embedded in the functioning of the empire. Positions in the Estado de India were openly bought and sold. A captaincy of a profitable fortress could cost thousands of cruzados in bribes and gifts to court officials in Lisbon, an investment that the purchaser expected to recoup many times over through the opportunities for private enrichment that the position provided. The system selected for greed. The men who obtained the most important positions were not the most competent or the most loyal, but the wealthiest and the best connected, and they governed accordingly. Gaspar Correa, writing with the weariness of a man who had watched the process for decades, noted that governors arrived in India poor and ambitious and departed rich and indifferent, leaving their successors to manage the consequences of their self-enrichment. The crown knew about the corruption. Every governor's instructions included stern prohibitions against private trade, self-dealing, and the misuse of crown resources. These prohibitions were universally ignored. The crown could not enforce them because the governors were 6 months away by sea, because the alternative governors were equally corrupt, and because the entire system depended on men willing to risk their lives in distant, hostile environments for pay that was wholly inadequate to the risks involved. Corruption was the unofficial compensation that made the official compensation tolerable. Eliminating it would have required either paying men what the positions were actually worth, which the crown could not afford, or replacing them with men of extraordinary selfless dedication, who did not exist in sufficient numbers to staff an empire. The third force was the slow erosion of Portugal's technological advantage. Now, the cannon that had given Albuquerque dominion over the Indian Ocean were not a permanent Portuguese monopoly. They were a momentary edge, and the moment was passing. Ottoman gunners had been casting cannon of European quality since the fall of Constantinople in 1453. By the mid-16th century, the Ottomans were building warships armed with heavy artillery that could match Portuguese vessels in firepower, if not always in seamanship. The Sultanate of Aceh in northern Sumatra acquired Ottoman cannon and Ottoman military advisors and used them to challenge Portuguese control of the Malacca Strait with increasing effectiveness. Indian states, particularly the Sultanate of Gujarat and later the Mughal Empire, incorporated firearms into their military arsenals and designed fortifications that could withstand Portuguese bombardment. The Japanese, as already noted, had leapfrogged the Portuguese entirely, manufacturing firearms in quantities that the Portuguese could not have imagined when they first arrived at Tanegashima. The proliferation of military technology was accelerated by the very renegades and deserters whose departure from Portuguese service was simultaneously draining the empire's manpower. Every Portuguese gunner who defected to an Indian court, every soldier who sold his expertise to a Muslim sultan, transferred knowledge that reduced the gap between Portuguese military capability and that of their adversaries. By the 1560s and 1570s, Portuguese naval superiority in the Indian Ocean, while still real, was no longer the absolute advantage it had been in Albuquerque's time. Portuguese ships could still win most engagements against most enemies. But they could no longer win all engagements against all enemies, and in an empire spread across 10,000 miles of ocean, protected by a few dozen undermanned fortresses, the difference between most and all was existential. It was into this slowly deteriorating situation that the greatest external blow fell, a blow that came not from the Indian Ocean, but from the Iberian Peninsula itself. In 1578, King Sebastiao I of Portugal, a young man of 24 whose personal piety was matched only by his personal recklessness, led a Portuguese army into Morocco on a crusade that no one with strategic judgment had recommended and everyone with political influence had failed to prevent. Sebastiao was obsessed with the idea of a new crusade against Islam, a grand military adventure that would revive the spirit of the Reconquista and establish Portugal as the defender of Christendom. He assembled an army of approximately 18,000 men, including much of Portugal's military nobility, and crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in the summer of 1578 to intervene in a Moroccan succession dispute that provided the pretext for the invasion he had always wanted. On the 4th of August, 1578, at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir, also known as the Battle of the Three Kings, the Portuguese army was annihilated. The Moroccan forces, numbering perhaps 50,000 and fighting on terrain they knew intimately, enveloped the Portuguese columns and destroyed them in a single afternoon of catastrophic violence. King Sebastiao was killed, though his body was never conclusively identified, a fact that would generate a messianic cult of Sebastianism, the belief that the young king would one day return to restore Portugal's glory, that persisted for centuries. The flower of Portuguese nobility died with him. 8,000 soldiers were killed on the field. 15,000 were captured and held for ransom. The ransoms demanded were so enormous that they consumed a substantial portion of Portugal's national wealth that was desperately needed to maintain the overseas empire. Alcácer Quibir was not merely a military defeat, it was a national decapitation. Sebastiao died without an heir. His successor was his elderly great-uncle, Cardinal Henrique, who was 66 years old, celibate, and in failing health. Henrique died in January 1580, leaving the Portuguese throne without a clear successor and the kingdom in a state of political paralysis at the worst possible moment. Philip II of Spain, who was Sebastiao's uncle through his mother's marriage, and who had been positioning himself for exactly this opportunity for years, pressed his claim to the Portuguese throne. Some Portuguese factions supported him, others resisted. Philip resolved the question in the manner that the Habsburgs preferred, which was to say with an army. In the summer of 1580, a Spanish force under the Duke of Alba invaded Portugal. Resistance was brief and ineffective. Philip was proclaimed King of Portugal, uniting the Spanish and Portuguese crowns in a personal union that would last 60 years. The Iberian Union, as this arrangement is known, did not formally abolish Portuguese sovereignty. King Philip promised to maintain Portuguese laws, institutions, and overseas possessions as separate from Spanish administration. Portuguese colonies would be governed by Portuguese officials. Portuguese trade would remain in Portuguese hands. On paper, Portugal retained its identity within the Union. In practice, the merger subordinated Portuguese strategic interests to Spanish ones at every point of conflict, and the points of conflict were numerous and consequential. The most damaging consequence was that Portugal inherited Spain's enemies. Spain in 1580 was locked in a series of conflicts that spanned the globe. The revolt of the Netherlands, the Cold War with England that would soon produce the Armada disaster, the long struggle with the Ottoman Empire for control of the Mediterranean. Portugal, under its own kings, he had maintained careful neutrality in these conflicts, trading with all parties, fighting none that it did not choose to fight. Under the Spanish crown, Portuguese neutrality ended. Portuguese possessions became legitimate targets for every power that was at war with Spain, which in the late 16th century meant nearly everyone. The Dutch were the most dangerous of these newly acquired enemies, and their assault on the Portuguese Empire would prove more devastating than anything the Indian Ocean powers had ever managed. The Dutch Republic, having fought its way to independence from Spanish rule through decades of savage warfare, was by the 1590s emerging as the most dynamic commercial and naval power in northern Europe. Dutch merchants had previously purchased their spices from Lisbon, acting as distributors for Portuguese imports to northern European markets. When the Spanish crown, seeking to punish Dutch rebellion, closed Lisbon's port to Dutch shipping, the Dutch responded with the logic of a commercial people denied access to a market. If they could not buy spices in Lisbon, they would go to the source. They would sail to the Indian Ocean themselves, and they would take from Portugal whatever they needed. The first Dutch fleet reached the Indian Ocean in 1596. Within a decade, Dutch ships were operating in force across the entire Portuguese maritime network, from the coast of East Africa to the Spice Islands, attacking Portuguese shipping, besieging Portuguese fortresses, while undercutting Portuguese trade by offering better prices and better goods to local merchants who had spent decades chafing under the Cartaz system. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, founded in 1602, was a commercial enterprise organized on a scale that dwarfed anything Portugal had ever assembled. It was capitalized at a level that made the Portuguese crown's annual Indian Ocean budget look like pocket money. It could send more ships, carry more guns, recruit more sailors, and sustain more losses than Portugal could match. And it was driven by a ferocious commercial logic that regarded Portuguese possessions not as sovereign territories to be respected, but as market share to be captured. The Dutch assault fell on Portuguese positions that were already weakened by decades of the forces described above. The demographic exhaustion, the corruption, the crumbling infrastructure, the eroding technological advantage. Fortresses that had held for decades against local powers fell to Dutch sieges that brought European-level artillery, European-level tactics, and European-level manpower to bear on walls designed to resist an earlier era of threat. Malacca, the second of Albuquerque's three gates, endured repeated Dutch attacks before finally falling in January 1641 after a siege that lasted several months. The garrison that surrendered was a fraction of the force that should have defended the city, and many of its soldiers were so weakened by disease and starvation that they could barely stand. The Spice Islands, the ultimate prize, fell piece by piece. The Dutch systematically expelled the Portuguese from the Moluccas, establishing their own monopoly over the nutmeg and clove trade with a thoroughness that the Portuguese had never achieved. The Dutch did not merely replace the Portuguese, they improved upon the Portuguese model of coercive monopoly, applying it with a commercial efficiency and a capacity for organized violence that made the Portuguese system look almost amateurish by comparison. The VOC's treatment of the indigenous populations of the Spice Islands, including the near-total destruction of the Bandanese people of the nutmeg-producing Banda Islands, was genocide conducted with balance sheets. The Portuguese had been brutal. The Dutch were brutal and systematic. Ceylon fell. The Cinnamon Island that had been one of the most profitable Portuguese possessions in Asia was lost to the Dutch in a series of campaigns that stretched from the 1630s to the 1660s. The Portuguese fortresses along the coast, Colombo, Galé, Jaffna, were besieged and taken one by one. The last Portuguese garrison in Ceylon surrendered in 1658. Hormuz had already been lost in 1622, not to the Dutch, but to a combined Anglo-Persian force that expelled the Portuguese from the fortress that Albuquerque had captured just over a century earlier. The English East India Company, another newly arrived competitor, had provided the naval firepower. The Persian Shah had provided the troops. Between them, they closed the first of Albuquerque's three gates and ended Portuguese control of the Persian Gulf. Of the three choke points that Albuquerque had identified as the keys to Indian Ocean dominance, Portugal lost all three within a century of his death. Hormuz in 1622. Malacca in 1641. The Spice Islands progressively through the first half of the 17th century. The Estado de India did not cease to exist. Portugal retained Goa, Daman, Diu, Macau, and scattered smaller possessions. But the system that Albuquerque had designed, the network of fortified nodes controlling the choke points of global trade, was broken. What remained was a collection of isolated outposts clinging to the edges of an ocean that other powers now dominated. The Iberian Union ended in 1640, when a group of Portuguese nobles, taking advantage of Spain's distraction by revolts in Catalonia and elsewhere, he stormed the royal palace in Lisbon and proclaimed the Duke of Braganza as King João IV. The Restoration, as the Portuguese call it, restored national independence but could not restore what 60 years of Spanish entanglement had cost. The empire that João IV inherited was a diminished thing, shorn of its most profitable Asian possessions, facing Dutch competition on every ocean, and dependent on a Brazilian colony whose sugar economy was itself under Dutch attack, the Dutch having occupied much of northeastern Brazil from 1630 to 1654. Portugal survived the Restoration because its remaining assets, particularly Brazil, were still valuable enough to fight for, and because the European balance of power, shifting as always, provided allies willing to support Portuguese independence as a check on Spanish ambitions. England, in particular, became Portugal's essential patron, providing military and naval support in exchange for commercial concessions that would, over time, make Portugal something close to an English economic satellite. The Treaty of Windsor in 1386 had established the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, the oldest diplomatic alliance still in force in the world. The treaties of the Restoration era transformed that alliance from a relationship of equals into one in which Portugal increasingly depended on English protection and paid for it with economic subordination. But even in its diminished state, the Portuguese Empire was not finished. It was transforming. The center of gravity was shifting, had been shifting for decades, from the Indian Ocean to the Atlantic, from spices to sugar, from Asia to Brazil. And it was in Brazil that Portugal would discover both the instrument of its imperial survival and the deepest expression of its imperial tragedy. The sugar economy of northeastern Brazil, concentrated in the captaincies of Pernambuco and Bahia, had by the late 16th century become the most productive agricultural enterprise in the Atlantic world. The Portuguese had perfected the plantation system on the Atlantic islands of Madeira and São Tomé before transplanting it to Brazil, and in the rich Massapé soils of the Brazilian northeast, they found conditions that exceeded anything the islands could offer. The combination of tropical climate, fertile soil, abundant water, and, crucially, a virtually unlimited land created the conditions for sugar production on a scale that transformed global commodity markets and generated wealth that increasingly compensated for the losses in Asia. But the wealth came at a cost that was measured in human lives, and the lives were African. By the mid-17th century, Brazil had become the largest single destination for the transatlantic slave trade. Portuguese slave ships, operating from bases in Angola and the Congo, transported hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to feed the insatiable demand of the sugar plantations. The port of Luanda in Angola became, in effect, a feeder colony for Brazil. Its primary economic function, the capture, purchase, and export of human beings. The relationship between Angola and Brazil was so intimate that the two colonies functioned almost as a single economic unit, connected by the slave ships that shuttled back and forth across the South Atlantic with their cargoes of human suffering. The enslaved Africans who built Brazil's sugar economy did not merely provide labor, they provided the demographic foundation of Brazilian society itself. By the 17th century, people of African descent, both enslaved and free, constituted the majority of Brazil's population. They brought with them languages, religions, musical traditions, agricultural knowledge, and cultural practices that fused with Portuguese and indigenous elements to create the distinctively Brazilian civilization that would eventually become the largest Portuguese-speaking society on earth. The capoeira of Bahia, the candomblé religious tradition, the samba rhythms that would become synonymous with Brazilian identity, all of these had their roots in the African communities that were forged in the crucible of slavery and that survived, adapted, and created despite conditions designed to deny them their humanity. Portugal did not plan to build a multiracial society in Brazil. It stumbled into one because its tiny population left it no alternative. There were never enough Portuguese men to colonize Brazil as a purely European settlement. There were never enough Portuguese women to maintain a purely Portuguese community through natural reproduction. The result was a degree of racial mixing, what the Portuguese called mestiçagem, that was far more extensive than anything that occurred in the English or Dutch colonial worlds, though it should be noted immediately that this mixing was not evidence of racial tolerance. It was overwhelmingly the product of exploitation, of Portuguese men exercising sexual power over enslaved African women and indigenous women who had no ability to refuse. The mixed-race children who resulted occupied an ambiguous social position, neither fully European nor fully enslaved, navigating a colonial hierarchy that was theoretically based on race but in practice was endlessly negotiable depending on wealth, patronage, and the willingness to perform Portuguese cultural identity, the complexity of Brazilian colonial society, its racial stratification, its cultural syncretism, its economic dependence on enslaved labor, its environmental transformation of a vast tropical landscape. All of this was unfolding during the same decades that Portugal was losing its Asian empire to the Dutch and the English. The two processes were related. As Asian revenues declined, Brazilian revenues became more important. As Brazilian revenues became more important, the demand for enslaved labor increased. As the demand for enslaved labor increased, the Portuguese slave trade expanded. As the slave trade expanded, the human cost of the Portuguese empire deepened. It was a chain of cause and effect that connected the fortresses of the Indian Ocean to the sugar mills of Pernambuco, to the slave markets of Luanda, to the devastated communities of the African interior, all of it powered by the same imperial logic, all of it flowing from the same original circumstance, a small, a poor country on the edge of Europe that had reached for the world and found that the world's wealth always came at the price of someone else's destruction. By the middle of the 17th century, the Portuguese Empire had been reshaped by forces its founders could not have anticipated. The Indian Ocean network that Albuquerque had built was broken. The Asian spice monopoly that had been the original purpose of the entire enterprise was gone. The Dutch and the English dominated the trade routes that Portugal had opened. But Brazil remained, and Brazil was growing, and Brazil was about to deliver one final transformative shock that would redefine Portugal's place in the world once more. Gold. The discovery that the Bandeirantes had been seeking for generations, in the mineral wealth that the Spanish had found in Mexico and Peru and that the Portuguese had envied with a bitterness sharpened by their own territory's apparent barrenness, was about to materialize in the highlands of interior Brazil, in quantities that would stagger the imagination of a nation that had been searching for precisely this for 200 years. In the 1690s, expeditions pushing into the interior of Brazil from the coastal settlement of São Paulo began finding gold in the riverbeds and hillsides of a region that would come to be called Minas Gerais, the General Mines. The Bandeirantes who made these discoveries were themselves one of the most extraordinary and troubling products of Portuguese colonialism. They were predominantly mestiço, mixed-race descendants of Portuguese settlers and indigenous Tupi women, who had spent generations pushing into the Brazilian interior on expeditions that combined exploration, slave raiding, and prospecting in roughly equal measure. They spoke Tupi as readily as Portuguese. They navigated the rivers and forests of the interior with skills learned from indigenous peoples whose communities they simultaneously destroyed. They were, in the most literal sense, the frontier edge of Portuguese colonization, and the world they moved through was one of almost unimaginable violence, directed primarily against the indigenous populations whose lands they penetrated and whose people they enslaved. The Bandeirantes had been searching for gold and precious stones for over a century, driven by the persistent belief that the interior of Brazil must contain mineral wealth comparable to what the Spanish had found in their American territories. The Spanish silver mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia had been generating wealth on a scale that reshaped the global economy since the 1540s. Portuguese Brazil, despite its vastness, had produced nothing comparable. The sugar economy was immensely profitable, but sugar was an agricultural commodity, subject to the uncertainties of weather, disease, soil exhaustion, and market fluctuation. Gold was different. Gold was permanent. Gold was power in its most concentrated and portable form, and the absence of gold in Portuguese America had been a source of national frustration that bordered on humiliation. Neuros. When the first significant deposits were confirmed in the river valleys of Minas Gerais in the final years of the 17th century, The news spread through the Portuguese Atlantic world with the speed of a contagion. What followed was the largest gold rush the world had yet seen, a mass migration that would transform Brazil, reshape Portugal, reorder the economic relationships of the entire Atlantic, and demonstrate one final time both the extraordinary reach and the fundamental fragility of the Portuguese imperial project. The rush began almost immediately. From the coastal cities of Bahia, Rio de Janeiro, and São Paulo, thousands of men abandoned their occupations and headed for the mining regions. Plantation owners left their estates, merchants closed their shops, soldiers deserted their garrisons, priests left their parishes. The pull of gold was so powerful that the coastal settlements experienced labor shortages that threatened the sugar economy, the very foundation of the colonial economy, within months of the first confirmed strikes. The governor of Rio de Janeiro wrote to Lisbon warning that the city was being emptied of its productive population, and that the rush, if unchecked, would destroy the established agricultural economy that sustained the colony. From Portugal itself, the news produced an even more dramatic response. Tens of thousands of Portuguese, drawn from every social class and every region of the kingdom, emigrated to Brazil in the first decades of the 18th century. The numbers are difficult to establish precisely, but the best estimates suggest that between 1700 and 1760, approximately 400,000 Portuguese left for Brazil, the majority headed for the mining regions of Minas Gerais and later Goiás and Mato Grosso, where additional gold and diamond deposits were discovered. 400,000 people, from a nation whose total population in 1700 was still under 2 million. It was a hemorrhage that made the annual India fleets of the 16th century look modest by comparison, and it fell on a population that had already been depleted by 2 centuries of overseas empire. The demographic consequences for Portugal were severe and immediate. Villages in the Minho, the Trás-os-Montes, and the Beira regions, the traditional sources of emigration, reported to the crown that entire communities were losing their young men. Agricultural production declined. Military recruitment suffered. The Cortes petitioned the crown repeatedly to restrict emigration, and the crown issued decrees attempting to limit the outflow, requiring passports for travel to Brazil, imposing penalties on unauthorized departure, even threatening to confiscate the property of those who left without permission. These measures were largely ineffective. The pull of gold was stronger than any royal decree, and the Portuguese coastline offered too many opportunities for clandestine departure for the authorities to control the flow. The mining regions themselves became, within a few years, the most dynamic and the most chaotic places in the Portuguese Empire. The early mining camps were lawless aggregations of prospectors, adventurers, enslaved Africans, indigenous laborers, traders, prostitutes, and criminals, thrown together in the river valleys of the Brazilian highlands, without institutions, without infrastructure, and without effective authority. Violence was endemic. Disputes over mining claims were settled by knife and musket. The bandeirantes who had discovered the gold deposits fought bitterly with the newcomers from the coast, and from Portugal, whom they regarded as interlopers stealing wealth that the Paulistas had found with their own hands and at the cost of their own blood. This conflict, known as the War of the Emboabas, erupted into open armed conflict in 1708 and 1709, producing battles, massacres, and a level of social disorder that forced the crown to intervene directly, establishing new administrative structures to govern the mining regions and, more importantly, to ensure that the crown received its legally mandated share of the gold. That share was the quinto, the royal fifth, a tax of 20% on all gold produced. Collecting it was a challenge that consumed more administrative energy than any other task the Portuguese colonial government faced. Miners concealed their production. Gold was smuggled out of the mining regions through routes that circumvented the official collection points. Corrupt officials accepted bribes to undercount the gold passing through their stations. The crown responded with increasingly elaborate systems of control, establishing foundry houses where all gold was required to be smelted and stamped before it could legally circulate, deploying inspectors and informers, imposing savage penalties on smugglers. including confiscation of all property and exile to Portuguese Africa, which in practice meant a death sentence from tropical disease. Despite these measures, a substantial proportion of Brazilian gold escaped the Quinto and entered the economy through unofficial channels. The Crown knew this. Everyone knew this. But even the fraction that was officially collected and taxed represented wealth on a scale that Portugal had not seen since the peak of the spice trade. The gold that flowed from Minas Gerais to the ports of Brazil and thence across the Atlantic to Lisbon was measured not in pounds but in tons. Modern estimates suggest that Brazil produced approximately 800 to 1,000 metric tons of gold during the 18th century, with peak production occurring between roughly 1735 and 1755. These are numbers that dwarf any previous gold production in history. The entire output of the West African gold trade that had first drawn the Portuguese down the coast of Africa in the 15th century was a fraction of what the mines of Minas Gerais produced in a single decade. The gold of the Americas, both Portuguese and Spanish, flooded into Europe in quantities that reshaped monetary systems, financed wars, and accelerated the economic transformations that would eventually produce the Industrial Revolution. But what did the gold do for Portugal? This is the question that has haunted Portuguese economic historians for 3 centuries, because the answer is, on its face, paradoxical. The gold made Portugal rich. It did not make Portugal prosperous. The distinction is critical and illuminating. King João V, who reigned from 1706 to 1750, presided over the peak of the Brazilian gold boom, and he spent with an extravagance that would have embarrassed even Manuel I. João built the convent of Mafra, an enormous palace monastery complex north of Lisbon, modeled on the Escorial, employing tens of thousands of workers and consuming a significant fraction of the gold revenues for over a decade. He sent lavish gifts to the papal court in Rome, including a chapel of solid gold that was transported across the Mediterranean in pieces and assembled in the church of Saint Roch in Lisbon. He maintained a court of Baroque magnificence, patronized the arts, funded libraries, and cultivated the image of a European monarch on par with Louis XIV of France or the Habsburg emperors. The gold paid for all of this. It also paid for Portugal's chronic trade deficit with the rest of Europe. Portugal in the 18th century imported virtually everything that a modern economy required: manufactured goods from England, textiles from France, grain from Northern Europe, military supplies from wherever they could be obtained. It exported almost nothing that its own economy produced. The gold flowed into Lisbon and immediately flowed out again. Payment for the imports that Portugal's underdeveloped domestic economy could not supply. Portugal was, once again, a pipeline. Brazilian gold entered on one side, and European manufactured goods entered on the other. And Portugal itself was merely the point of transfer, growing no more capable of self-sustaining economic growth than it had been when the same dynamic operated with Indian pepper 2 centuries earlier. The English were the primary beneficiaries of this arrangement. The Methuen Treaty of 1703, negotiated during the War of the Spanish Succession, established a commercial relationship between England and Portugal that was superficially reciprocal but structurally asymmetric. Portugal agreed to admit English woolen cloth at preferential tariff rates. England agreed to admit Portuguese wine, specifically port wine from the Douro Valley, at rates lower than those charged on French wine. The treaty was celebrated in Portugal as a diplomatic triumph, securing English military protection against Spanish ambitions while opening an important market for Portuguese agricultural exports. In practice, it flooded Portugal with cheap English manufactured goods that destroyed any nascent Portuguese industry that might have competed, while channeling Portuguese gold to English merchants and through them to the English economy, where it was invested in the productive enterprises, the factories, the infrastructure, the technological innovations that Portugal itself never developed. The economic historian Sandro Sederi calculated that during the first half of the 18th century, Brazilian gold transfers to England through the Portuguese trade deficit financed a significant portion of British capital formation during the early stages of industrialization. Portugal's gold, mined by enslaved Africans in Brazil, shipped across the Atlantic in Portuguese hulls, and collected by the Portuguese crown, ended up funding the economic revolution of its oldest ally. It was an outcome that would have struck Albuquerque, Henry the Navigator, or any of the architects of Portuguese expansion as a particularly cruel joke, though they might have recognized in it the same dynamic that had always defined Portugal's imperial enterprise, a small nation reaching for wealth it could not ultimately retain, generating enormous value that larger, more economically developed powers captured and compounded. The gold boom also accelerated the institution that had become the defining moral catastrophe of the Portuguese Empire. The mines of Minas Gerais ran on enslaved labor. Free men might stake claims and supervise operations, but the backbreaking work of extracting gold from riverbeds and hillsides, standing in water for hours, sifting gravel, digging shafts into unstable ground, was performed overwhelmingly by enslaved Africans. The demand for enslaved labor in the mining regions drove the transatlantic slave trade to new heights of volume during the 18th century. More enslaved Africans were transported to Brazil during the gold rush decades than during any comparable period of the sugar boom. The port of Luanda in Angola, the primary embarkation point, processed human beings with an efficiency that reflected generations of institutional experience in the trade. The conditions in the mines were, if anything, worse than those on the sugar plantations. Miners worked in freezing mountain streams exposed to the elements, performing physical labor of extreme intensity. Silicosis from rock dust, drowning in flooded shafts, crushing injuries from collapses, these were routine causes of death. The cold of the highlands, so different from the tropical coast, he killed men whose bodies had been weakened by the Middle Passage and by inadequate food and shelter. Life expectancy for an enslaved miner was measured in years, sometimes in months, and the calculation that had governed the sugar plantations, that it was cheaper to replace enslaved workers than to preserve them, operated with equal force in the mining camps. The enslaved communities of Minas Gerais responded to their conditions with every form of resistance available to them. They ran away, establishing quilombos, fugitive communities in the remote interior, some of which persisted for decades and grew to populations of hundreds or thousands. The most famous, the Quilombo dos Palmares in the northeastern interior, had been destroyed by Portuguese military expeditions in 1694. But smaller quilombos proliferated throughout the mining regions, providing refuge for those who escaped, and a constant reminder to the slave owners that their control was maintained by force and could be challenged by force. Enslaved people also resisted through work slowdowns, sabotage, theft of gold, and the maintenance of cultural and religious practices that preserved African identities against the dehumanizing logic of the slave system. The society that emerged in Minas Gerais during the gold boom was among the most complex and contradictory in the colonial Americas. It was a society of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary suffering, of Baroque churches decorated with gold leaf and slave quarters where human beings slept in chains. The gold funded a cultural flowering that produced some of the finest examples of Baroque and Rococo art and architecture in the Western Hemisphere. The sculptor and architect Alejandro, born Antonio Francisco Lisboa, the mixed-race son of a Portuguese carpenter and an enslaved African woman, created masterworks of religious sculpture in the churches of Ouro Preto and Congonhas that rank among the greatest artistic achievements of the 18th century. He worked despite a degenerative disease that eventually cost him the use of his hands and feet, strapping his tools to his wrist to continue carving. His art was funded by gold extracted by enslaved labor. The beauty and the horror were inseparable, literally built into the same structures. And anyone who admires the churches of Minas Gerais without acknowledging the hands that built them and the system that paid for them is seeing only half of what is there. The gold boom peaked around 1750 and declined steadily thereafter. The most accessible deposits were exhausted. The deep shaft mining techniques required to reach remaining deposits demanded capital investment and engineering expertise that the colonial mining industry could not provide. Production fell by half between 1760 and 1780 and continued to decline through the end of the century. The Crown, desperate to maintain revenues, increased the tax burden on the mining regions. demanding that the quinto yield a minimum annual amount regardless of actual production. When production fell below the level that could generate the required tax payment, the Crown threatened to impose the dirham, a compulsory assessment on the entire population of the mining regions to make up the shortfall. The dirham was so hated that its threatened imposition became one of the catalysts for the first significant conspiracy against Portuguese colonial rule, the Inconfidencia Mineira of 1789, a plot by colonial elites to declare independence from Portugal that was betrayed, crushed, and punished with the execution and dismemberment of its most famous participant, Tiradentes, whose quartered body was displayed at strategic locations throughout the mining regions as a warning. The decline of the gold boom left Portugal in a position that was, in its essentials, strikingly similar to the position it had occupied after the decline of the spice trade. Once again, in a stream of wealth that had flowed for decades dried up. Once again, the wealth had been consumed rather than invested. Once again, Portugal found itself dependent on a colonial economy whose most profitable sector was in decline, with a domestic economy that remained underdeveloped, a population that had been depleted by emigration, and a strategic position that depended on the goodwill of a more powerful ally whose interests did not always align with its own. The country that had sent Vasco da Gama around Africa 3 centuries earlier, that had built fortresses from Hormuz to Nagasaki, that had introduced Europe to the wealth of Asia and Africa to the horrors of the Middle Passage, was entering the 19th century as a second-tier European power, dependent on British protection, economically subordinate to its own colony in Brazil, and haunted by a past whose grandeur made the present feel like a prolonged national humiliation. And then Napoleon came for Lisbon. In November 1807, a French army under General Junot crossed the Spanish border and marched toward the Portuguese capital with orders to close the last European port still open to British trade. Napoleon's continental system, his attempt to strangle British commerce by closing every port on the European continent, required Portuguese compliance, and the Portuguese, trapped as always between the demands of a continental power and their dependence on their maritime ally, could not comply without destroying the English alliance that was their only guarantee of independence. The solution that the British and Portuguese governments devised was without precedent in the history of European monarchy. The entire Portuguese court, the royal family, the government, the treasury, the archives, the libraries, the administration, approximately 15,000 people in all, would evacuate Lisbon and sail to Brazil. The seat of the Portuguese Empire would be transferred from Europe to the Americas. The colony would become the metropole. The mother country would become, in effect, a province to be recaptured at a later date. The evacuation was chaotic. Junot's forces were closing on Lisbon. The ships were loaded in haste. Families were separated. Belongings were abandoned. The Prince Regent, João, who was governing in place of his incapacitated mother, Queen Maria I, embarked on the royal flagship in a state of distress that eyewitnesses described as something close to breakdown. The fleet sailed on the 29th of November. By 1807, escorted by British warships, carrying the physical embodiment of Portuguese sovereignty across the Atlantic to a colony that was about to discover that its relationship with the mother country had been inverted overnight. The arrival of the Portuguese court in Rio de Janeiro in March 1808 transformed Brazil irrevocably. João, governing as regent, and later as King João VI, opened Brazilian ports to international trade, effectively ending the colonial monopoly that had restricted Brazilian commerce to Portuguese intermediaries for 3 centuries. He established institutions that a colony had never possessed: a central bank, a printing press, a national library, a medical school, a military academy. He elevated Brazil from the status of colony to the status of kingdom, all making it theoretically equal to Portugal within a United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. These measures were driven by necessity, not generosity. The Portuguese court was in exile. It needed the revenues that open trade would generate. It needed the institutional infrastructure that a functioning government required. And it needed the loyalty of the Brazilian colonial elite, who had long resented the restrictions that the colonial system imposed on their economic and political aspirations. But the consequences of the court's presence in Rio extended far beyond what necessity demanded. For the first time, Brazil experienced something that no other European colony in the Americas had experienced. It had the sovereign on its soil. It was not being governed from across an ocean by administrators who had never seen the territory they administered. The king was there in Rio de Janeiro, surrounded by Brazilian landscapes, dependent on Brazilian revenues, increasingly integrated into Brazilian society. When the Napoleonic Wars ended and the political situation in Europe stabilized, the question became whether João would return to Lisbon. Portugal demanded it. The Liberal Revolution of 1820, which established a constitutional government in Lisbon, insisted that the king return and that Brazil revert to its former colonial status. Brazil resisted. The colonial elite, having tasted autonomy and direct access to the sovereign, had no intention of returning to subordination, and João's son Pedro, who had been raised in Brazil since childhood and who identified more with Rio de Janeiro than with Lisbon, made the decision that his father could not. On the 7th of September 1822, on the banks of the Ipiranga River near São Paulo, Pedro declared Brazilian independence from Portugal. It was a separation that was, by the standards of colonial independence movements, remarkably peaceful. There was no prolonged war of liberation, no mass violence, no revolutionary terror. The prince of the colonizing power became the emperor of the independent nation. The colonial relationship ended not with a rupture, but with a transformation. The son breaking from the father while retaining the family name, the language, and the institutional frameworks that the father had established. Portugal recognized Brazilian independence in 1825, under British mediation and in exchange for a financial indemnity that Brazil paid and that Portugal desperately needed. The loss of Brazil was the final and most consequential amputation of the Portuguese Empire. Brazil had been for over a century the economic foundation on which Portuguese sovereignty rested. Its sugar, its gold, its diamonds, its tobacco, its cotton had funded the Portuguese state, maintained the Portuguese court, and financed Portugal's participation in European affairs. Without Brazil, Portugal was what it had been in 1400, a small, poor country on the western edge of Europe, boxed in by Spain on one side and the Atlantic on the other, with an economy that could not support its population and a military that could not defend its independence without external assistance. What remained of the empire were the fragments that no one else had yet taken or wanted badly enough to fight for. In Africa, Portugal retained a chain of coastal territories that stretched from the Cape Verde Islands in the mid-Atlantic to Mozambique on the southeastern coast of the continent, Angola on the west coast, Guinea on the upper west coast, São Tomé and Príncipe in the Gulf of Guinea, Mozambique on the east. These were not colonies in the sense that Brazil had been a colony. They were, for the most part, thin coastal strips where Portuguese authority extended a few miles inland at best, maintained by garrisons that were small, poorly supplied, and dependent on local alliances that shifted with the political winds. The interiors of these territories were governed by African kingdoms and peoples who had never consented to Portuguese sovereignty, and who regarded the Portuguese coastal presence as a nuisance to be tolerated, exploited, or expelled depending on circumstances. Angola was the most significant of these African possessions, and its significance was inseparable from its function in the slave trade. For 3 centuries, Angola had served primarily as a source of enslaved labor for Brazil. The port of Luanda, the administrative capital, had processed more enslaved human beings than any other single point of embarkation in the history of the Atlantic slave trade. The economy of Portuguese Angola was, in the most literal sense, an economy built on the buying and selling of people. So when the slave trade was progressively abolished during the 19th century under sustained British pressure that combined moral argument with naval force, the economic foundation of Portuguese Angola collapsed. There was almost nothing else. The Portuguese had not developed agriculture, mining, manufacturing, or any other economic activity in Angola that could replace the revenues that the slave trade had generated. They had not built roads, schools, hospitals, or the infrastructure of a functioning colonial administration. They had built slave trading posts, and when the trade ended, the posts had no purpose. The abolition of the slave trade was not a moment of Portuguese moral awakening. It was a concession extracted by British power, resisted by Portuguese interests at every stage, and implemented with a reluctance that bordered on sabotage. Portugal formally abolished the slave trade in stages, beginning in 1836 with a decree that prohibited the export of enslaved people from Portuguese territories, and concluding in 1869 with the formal abolition of slavery itself within all Portuguese possessions. But the enforcement of these decrees was, for decades, a fiction. Clandestine slave trading continued from Angola and Mozambique well into the 1850s, with Portuguese officials either turning a blind eye or actively participating in the illegal commerce. British naval patrols intercepting slave ships off the African coast found Portuguese vessels carrying enslaved Africans years after the trade had been legally prohibited. And the diplomatic correspondence between London and Lisbon on the subject was a decades-long exercise in British frustration and Portuguese evasion. Even after the formal abolition of slavery, the conditions of African labor in Portuguese territories remained, in practice, barely distinguishable from slavery itself. The Portuguese developed systems of forced labor, most notoriously the regime of contract labor that compelled African men and women to work on European-owned plantations and in European-owned enterprises for wages so low and under conditions so coercive that the distinction between contract labor and slavery was one of legal terminology rather than lived experience. The São Tomé cocoa scandal of the early 20th century, in which British chocolate manufacturers discovered that the cocoa they were purchasing from Portuguese São Tomé was produced by Angolan and Mozambican laborers who had been transported to the island under conditions of effective enslavement, generated international outrage and British boycotts, but produced only marginal reforms in Portuguese labor practices. The persistence of forced labor in Portuguese Africa was not an accident or an aberration. It was a structural necessity created by the same fundamental condition that had shaped every aspect of Portuguese imperial history, the smallness of Portugal itself. A nation of 4 to 5 million people in the 19th century, still poor by Western European standards, still economically underdeveloped, still dependent on its colonies for whatever international standing it retained, and could not afford to pay African labor at rates that would make colonial enterprises profitable while also compensating workers fairly. The mathematics were as brutal as they had always been. The empire required labor. The labor had to be cheap. And cheap, in the context of Portuguese Africa, meant coerced. This was the inheritance that Portugal carried into the era of the new imperialism, the frenzied European scramble for African territory that defined the final decades of the 19th century. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which established the ground rules for European partition of Africa, forced Portugal to confront a reality that it had been avoiding for centuries. Having a claim to African territory was no longer sufficient. The other European powers, particularly Britain, France, Germany, and Belgium, demanded that colonial claims be backed by effective occupation, meaning actual administrative control, military presence, and economic development extending beyond the coastal strips that Portugal had clung to for 400 years. Portugal's response to the scramble for Africa was driven by a combination of imperial nostalgia, national insecurity, and genuine fear that the loss of its African territories would reduce the country to complete irrelevance in European affairs. The Portuguese public and political class had developed over the course of the 19th century an attachment to the idea of empire that was inversely proportional to the empire's actual value. The less the colonies contributed to Portuguese prosperity, the more emotionally invested the Portuguese became in retaining them. The empire had become the primary marker of Portuguese national identity, the proof that Portugal was not merely a small peripheral European country, but a global power with a civilizing mission and a historical destiny. To lose the colonies would be to lose the last thread connecting modern Portugal to the age of da Gama and Albuquerque, and that thread, however frayed, was one that no Portuguese government could afford to sever voluntarily. The most dramatic confrontation of this period came in 1890, when Britain issued an ultimatum demanding that Portugal withdraw from territories in Central Africa that connected Angola to Mozambique. Portugal had claimed this vast interior region, a corridor stretching across what is now Zambia and Zimbabwe. Based on historical priority and the explorations of Serpa Pinto and other Portuguese travelers. The claim was embodied in a document known as the Rose-Colored Map, a cartographic assertion of Portuguese sovereignty over a continuous band of territory from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. It was a magnificent vision. It was also utterly incompatible with British plans for a Cape to Cairo corridor of British territory running north-south through the same region. The British ultimatum was delivered on the 11th of January 1890, and it gave Portugal no room for negotiation. Withdraw or face the consequences being understood by everyone to include the use of British naval power against Portuguese interests globally. Portugal withdrew. It had no choice. The military disparity was absolute. And the economic dependence on British trade and British financial markets left Portugal with no leverage whatsoever. The rose-colored map was abandoned. The dream of a transcontinental Portuguese Africa died in a single diplomatic exchange. The humiliation was felt across Portuguese society with an intensity that reshaped the country's politics. Riots broke out in Lisbon and Porto. The British ultimatum was perceived not merely as a diplomatic defeat, but as a national betrayal, inflicted by Portugal's oldest ally, the nation that had been bound by treaty to Portuguese interests since 1386. Anti-British sentiment surged. The Portuguese monarchy, which had accepted the ultimatum, lost legitimacy that it would never recover. The political instability that followed contributed directly to the Republican Revolution of 1910. Which overthrew the monarchy and established a republic that promised to restore Portuguese honor through a more vigorous colonial policy. The republic failed to deliver on this promise, as it failed to deliver on most of its promises, and was itself overthrown in 1926 by a military coup that eventually produced the figure who would define Portugal's relationship with its empire for the next half-century. Antonio de Oliveira Salazar, an economics professor from the University of Coimbra who became prime minister in 1932 and ruled Portugal as an authoritarian dictator until 1968, built his entire political project around the idea that Portugal's empire was not merely a collection of overseas territories, but an organic extension of Portugal itself. The colonies were not colonies in Salazar's formulation. They were overseas provinces, the integral parts of a single, indivisible, multiracial, transcontinental nation that stretched from the Minho River to Timor. This was a fiction, and everyone who examined it carefully knew it was a fiction. The so-called overseas provinces were governed by Portuguese administrators who treated African populations as subjects rather than citizens. Forced labor continued in various forms until the 1960s. Education for Africans was minimal. Political rights were non-existent. The assimilado system, which theoretically allowed Africans who adopted Portuguese language, religion, and cultural practices to achieve a legal status equivalent to Portuguese citizenship, was designed to be nearly impossible to navigate and affected a tiny fraction of the population. In Mozambique in 1950, out of a population of approximately 6 million Africans, fewer than 5,000 had achieved assimilado status. The system was not a pathway to equality. It was a mechanism for demonstrating statistically and legally that the vast majority of Africans were unfit for the rights that their Portuguese overlords enjoyed. But Salazar's fiction served a domestic purpose that was more important to him than its correspondence with reality. It gave the Portuguese people a narrative of national significance that compensated for the country's poverty, its political isolation, and its irrelevance to the great power dynamics of the 20th century. Portugal might be the poorest country in Western Europe. It might be governed by a dictatorship while its neighbors democratized. It might be unable to feed its own population without emigration serving as a permanent safety valve. But it was still an empire. It still had a presence in Africa and Asia that connected it to the age of exploration and the age of discovery. It was still In the language that Salazar cultivated with relentless propaganda, a nation with a civilizing mission. The rest of the world was moving in a different direction. The great wave of decolonization that swept across Asia and Africa after the Second World War dismantled the British, French, Dutch, and Belgian empires in a process that was sometimes negotiated, sometimes violent, but everywhere driven by the same irresistible combination of nationalist mobilization, Cold War dynamics, and the moral delegitimization of colonial rule. India became independent in 1947, Indonesia in 1949, Ghana in 1957, the Congo in 1960, Algeria after a savage war in 1962. By the mid-1960s, the European colonial empires that had partitioned Africa and Asia among themselves were being dismantled with a speed that would have seemed inconceivable a generation earlier. Portugal refused to follow. Salazar declared that decolonization was a phenomenon specific to other nations' empires, empires built on exploitation and racial domination that deserved to be dismantled. Portugal's empire was different, Salazar insisted. It was multiracial. It was based on assimilation rather than segregation. It was rooted in a 500-year tradition of cultural exchange and spiritual mission. These claims were ludicrous to anyone who had visited Portuguese Africa, but they were believed, or at least repeated, by enough of the Portuguese political establishment and enough of the Portuguese public to sustain a policy of imperial intransigence that would ultimately cost Portugal more in blood and treasure than the empire had generated in decades. The wars began in 1961. On the 4th of February, armed insurgents attacked the prison of São Paulo in Luanda, attempting to free political prisoners held by the Portuguese colonial authorities. The attack was small, poorly organized, and easily suppressed. But it was followed in March by a far larger and more devastating uprising in northern Angola, where members of the União das Populações de Angola, the UPA, launched coordinated attacks on Portuguese farms, settlements, and administrative posts across a wide area of the coffee-growing region. The violence was extreme. Hundreds of Portuguese settlers were killed, many with machetes and farming implements, in attacks that targeted European and mestizo populations with an indiscriminate fury that reflected decades of accumulated grievance against the colonial system. Women and children were among the dead. The atrocities were real, and they were extensively documented by Portuguese authorities and media, who used them to justify the military response that followed. That military response was itself characterized by atrocities on a scale that dwarfed the initial uprising. Portuguese forces, reinforced by troops airlifted from Lisbon, conducted reprisal operations across northern Angola that killed thousands of African civilians, burned villages, and displaced tens of thousands from their homes. Napalm was used. Suspected insurgents were executed without trial. The counterinsurgency campaign established a pattern that would persist for 13 years. The Portuguese military maintained control of the major towns and transport routes while the insurgent movements controlled or contested the rural interior, and the civilian population caught between them suffered the consequences of both. Angola was not the only front. In 1963, armed resistance began in Portuguese Guinea, the small West African territory that is now Guinea-Bissau, led by the Partido Africano da Independencia da Guiné y Cabo Verde, the PAIGC, under the charismatic and militarily gifted Amilcar Cabral. Guinea was the smallest and poorest of Portugal's African territories, and it became the most militarily challenging. The terrain, a landscape of rivers, swamps, and dense tropical vegetation, favored guerrilla warfare and neutralized many of the advantages that conventional military forces normally enjoyed. Cabral, who had studied agronomy in Lisbon and understood Portuguese society as well as any of his adversaries, built the PAIGC into one of the most effective liberation movements in Africa, combining military operations with the establishment of parallel governance structures in the territory he controlled, including schools, clinics, and a functioning civil administration that demonstrated to the population and to the international community that an alternative to Portuguese rule was not merely theoretical, but operational. In 1964, the war extended to Mozambique, where the Frente de Libertação de Moçambique, Frelimo, launched its first military operations in the northern provinces. Mozambique was the largest of Portugal's African territories, stretching along 2,500 kilometers of the southeastern African coast, and the insurgency there would prove to be the most strategically significant of the three conflicts because Mozambique shared borders with newly independent African states, Tanzania and Zambia, that provided rear bases, training facilities, and diplomatic support to the liberation movements. Portugal was now fighting simultaneously on three fronts, separated by thousands of miles, against enemies who enjoyed growing international support, moral legitimacy in the eyes of most of the world, and the strategic advantage of fighting defensive wars in terrain they knew intimately. The Portuguese military, which had not fought a major war since the First World War, was forced to mobilize on a scale that consumed an ever-increasing share of the national budget. At the peak of the wars, Portugal had approximately 150,000 troops deployed across its three African territories, a mobilization that, relative to population, exceeded what the United States committed to Vietnam. The cost was staggering. Military expenditure consumed 40 to 50% of the national budget during the war years. The draft stripped young men from an economy that was already losing tens of thousands annually to emigration, as Portuguese workers fled the poverty of Salazar's Estado Novo for the factories and construction sites of France, Germany, and Luxembourg. The combination of military conscription and economic emigration produced a demographic crisis that echoed, with eerie precision, the crises of the 16th and 18th centuries. Once again, Portugal was losing its young men to an imperial enterprise that consumed more than it returned. Once again, the fields and workshops were emptied. Once again, the women and the elderly bore the burden of maintaining a society whose productive core had been extracted. The wars dragged on through the 1960s and into the 1970s with no resolution in sight. The Portuguese military could not win because the liberation movements could not be destroyed as long as they retained popular support and external sanctuaries. The liberation movements could not win, at least not militarily, because the Portuguese commitment to holding the territories was unconditional, and the military resources committed were sufficient to prevent outright defeat. The result was a grinding stalemate that consumed lives on all sides without producing any outcome that justified the sacrifice. Salazar himself did not see the end. He suffered a stroke in 1968 and was replaced by Marcelo Caetano, who inherited the wars, the dictatorship, and the impossible strategic position without the ideological rigidity that had at least given Salazar's policy a perverse coherence. Caetano understood that the wars were unsustainable. He hinted at reforms. He gestured toward autonomy for the overseas territories, but he could not bring himself to accept the only solution that would end the fighting, which was independence. The military establishment, the colonial settler communities, the economic interests that profited from the African territories, and the ideological legacy of Salazarism all constrained his options. He continued the wars because stopping them would have required dismantling the political system that kept him in power. The wars ended not through negotiation or military resolution, but through revolution in Portugal itself. On the 25th of April, 1974, a group of young military officers calling themselves the Movimento das Forças Armadas, the Armed Forces Movement, overthrew the Caetano government in a nearly bloodless coup that became known as the Carnation Revolution, after the flowers that civilians placed in the barrels of the soldiers' rifles. The officers who organized the coup were not politicians or ideologues. They were career military men, many of them veterans of the African wars, who had concluded through direct experience that the wars could not be won, that the dictatorship that sustained them could not be reformed, and that Portugal's future required the abandonment of both. The revolution transformed Portugal overnight. Political prisoners were released, censorship was abolished, political parties were legalized, and the colonial wars were ended not gradually, not through phased withdrawal, but with a speed that astonished the world and produced consequences that would reverberate across Africa for decades. Guinea-Bissau, which had already declared independence in 1973 and been recognized by much of the international community, was formally acknowledged. Mozambique became independent in June 1975 under Frelimo governance. Angola became independent in November 1975, though the absence of a unified independence movement produced a civil war that would last with interruptions until 2002 and would kill hundreds of thousands of people. East Timor, the half-island in Southeast Asia that Portugal had held since the 16th century, declared independence in November 1975 and was immediately invaded by Indonesia, beginning a 24-year occupation characterized by mass atrocities that killed perhaps a quarter of the Timorese population. The Portuguese settlers in Africa, approximately 300,000 in Angola and 200,000 in Mozambique, were overwhelmingly repatriated to Portugal in a chaotic, traumatic exodus that the Portuguese called the retornados. These were people, many of them born in Africa, who had built lives, businesses, and communities in the colonies, and who were forced to abandon everything within weeks or months. They arrived in a Portugal that was itself in political and economic turmoil, that had no infrastructure to receive them, and that regarded them with a mixture of sympathy and resentment. The retornados became one of the defining social phenomena of post-revolutionary Portugal, a community of displaced persons whose experience embodied the final cost of an imperial project that had begun 500 years earlier when Henry the Navigator sent his first ships south along the African coast. The Revolution of 1974 did not merely end Portugal's colonial wars, it ended Portugal's empire. 563 years after the capture of Ceuta in 1415, the project that had defined Portugal's identity, shaped its economy, it drained its population, enriched its elite, destroyed the lives of millions of non-European peoples, and given a nation of 1 million the capacity to reshape the world was finished. Macau, the last significant overseas territory, was returned to China in 1999. A quiet ceremony that closed a chapter opened when Portuguese traders first anchored in the Pearl River Delta 4.5 centuries earlier. What remains when the flags have been lowered and the fortresses have been handed over and the last ships have sailed home is the question that has haunted every serious historian who has studied the Portuguese Empire and that haunts, in different ways, every nation that was touched by it. What did it mean? What did 5.5 centuries of global reach by a country smaller than Indiana actually produce for Portugal and for the world? And how should we understand an enterprise that was simultaneously one of the most extraordinary achievements in human history and one of its most comprehensive moral catastrophes? The temptation, when surveying the wreckage and the grandeur together, is to reach for simple verdicts. The nationalist version, cultivated by Salazar and still visible in certain currents of Portuguese public memory, holds that the empire was a civilizing mission, that Portugal brought Christianity, commerce, and culture to peoples who lacked them, and that the violence was regrettable but incidental to a fundamentally noble enterprise. The anti-colonial version, equally totalizing, holds that the empire was organized robbery from start to finish, meaning that every Portuguese achievement overseas was built on stolen labor and stolen resources, and that the legacy is one of unmitigated destruction. Both versions contain elements of truth. Neither is adequate. The story is more complicated than either allows, not because the moral questions are ambiguous, they often are not, but because the human reality was irreducibly complex and reducing it to a single judgment, whether celebratory or condemnatory, sacrifices the specificity that makes history meaningful. Consider the linguistic legacy alone. Portuguese is today the 6th most spoken language on Earth, the native tongue of approximately 260 million people spread across 4 continents. Brazil, with its 215 million inhabitants, is the largest Portuguese-speaking country. But the language is also the official language of Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, East Timor, and Macau, as well as of Portugal itself. The Lusophone world, the community of nations connected by the Portuguese language, spans the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, encompassing societies as different as the favelas of São Paulo and the fishing villages of the Mozambican coast, the hill towns of Timor-Leste, and the Baroque churches of Porto. This linguistic community did not emerge from a natural process of cultural exchange. It was imposed by conquest, colonization, and the systematic suppression of indigenous languages that accompanied Portuguese expansion everywhere it went. The Jesuit missions in Brazil deliberately replaced Tupi languages with Portuguese as a tool of cultural assimilation. The colonial education systems in Africa, to the extent that they existed at all, taught in Portuguese and dismissed African languages as inadequate for civilized discourse. The language spread not because people chose it, but because the structures of power left them no alternative. And yet the language, once implanted, became something other than an instrument of domination. It became a vehicle for literatures, for music, for political movements, for identities that had nothing to do with Portugal, and everything to do with the communities that adopted and transformed the language for their own purposes. The Portuguese that is spoken in Luanda is not the Portuguese of Lisbon. The Portuguese that Machado de Assis used to write some of the greatest novels of the 19th century bears the imprint of Brazilian experience in ways that no Lisbon editor could have predicted or controlled. The language escaped its creators. It became common property. And in becoming common property, it became something that Portugal can neither fully claim nor fully disown. The same paradox applies to religion. The Catholicism that Portuguese missionaries carried to 4 continents was, in its original intention, a tool of imperial control as much as a spiritual offering. The Padroado, the system of papal grants that gave the Portuguese crown authority over Catholic missions in its overseas territories, made the church an arm of the state and the faith an instrument of colonial policy. Conversion was encouraged, sometimes coerced, and always understood by the Portuguese authorities as serving political as well as spiritual ends. A converted population was a compliant population, or so the theory held. A Christian chief in the Congo was a Portuguese ally. A baptized Japanese daimyo was a trading partner. A Catholic community in Goa was a garrison of loyalty in a sea of potential resistance. But faith, like language, proved impossible to control once it was transmitted. The Christianity that took root in the Congo kingdom, initially adopted by the ruling elite as a tool for securing Portuguese alliance and trade goods, evolved over generations into a syncretic religious tradition that incorporated Central African cosmological concepts in ways that would have baffled and horrified the Franciscan missionaries who first preached there. The Catholicism of Brazilian slaves, prohibited from practicing their own religions, created candomblé and umbanda, traditions that clothed African deities in the vestments of Catholic saints, and maintained spiritual continuities that the colonial church could suppress on the surface but could never extinguish. The Christianity of Japan, driven underground by the brutal persecutions of the Tokugawa shogunate after 1614, survived for 250 years as a hidden faith practiced by communities that had no priests, no sacraments, and no contact with the outside world, preserving a version of 16th century Portuguese Catholicism in oral traditions that were finally revealed when Japan reopened to the West in the 1850s. When French missionaries arrived in Nagasaki in 1865 and built a new church, a group of elderly Japanese approached them and whispered that they too were Christians, descendants of the converts that Francis Xavier and his Portuguese Jesuit successors had made 3 centuries earlier. The missionaries wept. The hidden Christians of Japan were practicing a faith that bore only a partial resemblance to Roman Catholicism as it existed in the 19th century, but the thread connecting them to the Portuguese missionaries of the 1540s was unbroken. These are legacies that resist simple moral categorization. They are the products of coercion that became sources of meaning. They are impositions that became inheritances. They are wounds that became identities. And they exist alongside legacies that permit no such ambiguity at all. The slave trade. Voyage in Maurice. The 12.5 million Africans transported across the Atlantic, of whom the Portuguese were responsible for roughly 5.5 million, the largest share of any single European nation. The millions more who died in the process of capture, in the barracoons of the West African coast, on the Middle Passage, in the first brutal months of plantation labor. The civilizations disrupted, the communities destroyed, the demographic catastrophe inflicted on the African continent, whose population in 1850 was smaller than it had been in 1600, in significant part because of the hemorrhage of the slave trade. The racial hierarchies established in Brazil, which formally abolished slavery only in 1888, the last country in the Western Hemisphere to do so, and which has never fully reckoned with the structural racism that slavery bequeathed to a society that congratulated itself on its racial harmony while consigning the majority of its black population to poverty, exclusion, and vulnerability to state violence. The Portuguese did not enslave more Africans than other European nations because they were uniquely cruel. They enslaved more because they started earlier, continued longer, and built economic systems that demanded enslaved labor more intensely than any comparable colonial enterprise. The sugar plantations of Brazil and the mines of Minas Gerais were machines that consumed human beings as fuel, and the supply lines that fed those machines stretched back across the Atlantic to the slave markets of Luanda and Benguela and São Tomé, and from there into the interior of Africa, where the capture of people for sale to the Portuguese transformed political structures, militarized societies, and redirected entire economies toward the production of the one commodity that the European market valued above all others from Africa: human flesh. This is not a legacy that can be balanced against navigational achievements or architectural beauty. It is a legacy that must be stated plainly without mitigation, because the people who suffered it were real, because their suffering was the foundation on which much of the Portuguese imperial achievement rested, and because the consequences of that suffering are still being lived by their descendants today. The churches of Ouro Preto are beautiful. The gold that gilds them was mined by enslaved hands. Both facts are true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. The biological consequences of Portuguese expansion were equally profound and equally irreversible, though they were largely unintentional. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish sustained contact between the disease environments of Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas, and the microbiological exchanges that accompanied their voyages transformed the populations of every continent they touched. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other Eurasian diseases carried aboard Portuguese ships to populations with no immunological defenses, devastated indigenous communities in Brazil with a thoroughness that military conquest could never have achieved. The demographic collapse of Brazil's indigenous population in the 16th and 17th centuries, from an estimated pre-contact population of several million to a fraction of that number within a few generations, was primarily the result of epidemic disease, not of direct violence, though direct violence contributed significantly. The Portuguese did not understand germ theory. They did not deliberately weaponize disease, as some later colonial powers arguably did, but the diseases traveled with them regardless, and the deaths that resulted were as much a consequence of Portuguese expansion as the deaths inflicted by Portuguese cannon. The ecological transformations were equally sweeping. Portuguese ships carried plants, animals, and agricultural practices across oceanic barriers that had separated biological communities for millions of years. Sugar cane and Asian grass was transplanted to Brazil and transformed the landscape of the northeastern coast. Cattle and horses, European animals unknown in the Americas, were introduced to Brazil and eventually spread across the continent. African food crops, carried aboard the same slave ships that transported their cultivators, took root in the Americas and became staples of New World agriculture. Manioc, a New World plant, was carried by Portuguese traders to Africa, where it became one of the continent's most important food sources. The Columbian Exchange, the vast biological interchange between the hemispheres that Alfred Crosby documented, was initiated not by Columbus but by the Portuguese, whose earlier and more sustained contacts with Africa, Asia, and eventually the Americas set in motion ecological changes whose consequences are still unfolding. The cartographic legacy is perhaps the one dimension of Portuguese expansion that admits the least moral complication, though even here the knowledge was gathered in the service of conquest. The Portuguese mapped the world, not metaphorically, literally. Before Portuguese expansion, European maps of the world beyond the Mediterranean were exercises in speculation and fantasy, populated by mythical kingdoms and imaginary monsters, their coastlines invented, their oceans unmeasured, their continents misshapen or missing entirely. By the mid-16th century, Portuguese cartographers had produced charts of the African coast, the Indian Ocean, the coasts of India and Southeast Asia, the approaches to China and Japan, and the Atlantic coast of South America that were recognizably accurate by modern standards. The planisphere of Cantino, ours smuggled out of Portugal in 1502 by an Italian spy, showed the coastlines of Africa, India, and Brazil with a precision that astonished the European courts that obtained copies. The navigational charts compiled by Portuguese pilots, the roteiros that recorded winds, currents, depths, and landmarks along the maritime routes, represented an accumulation of observational knowledge that was unprecedented in scope and that formed the foundation for all subsequent European navigation. This knowledge was gathered by men who sailed into the unknown at the risk of their lives, who spent months in open ocean with instruments that were primitive by any modern standard, who recorded what they observed with a precision that reflected both professional training and institutional demand. But the Portuguese crown treated navigational knowledge as a state secret, and for good reason. The charts were the competitive advantage. They were the difference between a voyage that reached India and one that ended on a reef off the African coast. The cartographers, the cosmographers, the pilots who compiled and corrected and updated the charts were the unsung intellectual workforce of the Portuguese Empire, and their collective achievement, the mapping of the world's oceans, was a contribution to human knowledge that endures regardless of the purposes to which it was put. The navigational techniques that the Portuguese developed or refined had consequences that extended far beyond Portugal's own empire. The volta do mar, the technique of sailing far out into the ocean to catch favorable winds rather than hugging the coast, it was a conceptual breakthrough that transformed Atlantic navigation. The systematic compilation of latitude observations, wind patterns, and current data created the first oceanic databases, bodies of knowledge that accumulated across generations of voyages, and that could be transmitted, stolen, or purchased by other nations. The English, the Dutch, the French, and eventually every maritime nation in Europe built their own oceanic enterprises on knowledge that the Portuguese had gathered first, often in Portuguese ships with Portuguese instruments using Portuguese techniques. The institutional model of Portuguese exploration, the idea that oceanic discovery could be organized as a state project sustained across decades, funded by the Crown, and directed towards strategic objectives, was itself a legacy of enormous consequence. Henry the Navigator's program of systematic exploration down the African coast was the first example in European history of what would later be called research and development. The deliberate, sustained investment of resources in the pursuit of knowledge whose practical applications were uncertain, but whose potential returns justified the risk. Every subsequent European exploration program, from the Dutch East India Company's charting of the Pacific to NASA's space program, owes something to the model that Portugal pioneered in the 15th century. The idea that a nation's strategic future could depend on the systematic expansion of knowledge about the physical world was not obvious before Portugal demonstrated it. And it seems obvious now only because Portugal's demonstration was so successful that it became a permanent feature of how powerful nations understand their relationship to the unknown. But the question remains, what did the empire do to Portugal itself? The answer is visible in the country that emerged from the Carnation Revolution in 1974, and that exists today. Portugal, in the early 1970s, was the poorest country in Western Europe. Its per capita income was a fraction of that of France, Germany, or Britain. Its literacy rate was the lowest in the region. Its infrastructure was decades behind its neighbors. Its political system was a dictatorship that justified its existence in part through the maintenance of an empire that consumed more than it returned. The country that had opened the world's oceans, that had built the first global trade network, that had generated wealth sufficient to fund the palaces of Mafra and the monasteries of Belém, was, at the end of its imperial era, a nation that had failed to translate 5 centuries of global enterprise into domestic development. This was not an accident. It was the consequence of a pattern established in the earliest decades of expansion and never broken. Portuguese imperial wealth was extracted wealth. It was pepper from India, gold from Brazil, cocoa from São Tomé, labor from Angola. It passed through Portugal, but was not generated by Portugal's own economic activity. The domestic economy, the agriculture, the manufacturing, the infrastructure that would have provided self-sustaining growth was neglected in every century because the imperial revenues made neglect tolerable. Why develop textile manufacturing when you could buy English cloth with Brazilian gold? Why invest in agricultural improvement when you could import grain with spice trade revenues? Why educate the population when the empire needed soldiers and sailors, not engineers and entrepreneurs? The result was a country that was simultaneously an empire and a dependency, a nation that ruled others while being economically subordinate to its own allies. The relationship with England, the oldest alliance, was the clearest expression of this paradox. England protected Portugal's independence and Portugal's empire. In exchange, Portugal opened its markets to English goods, channeled its colonial wealth through English financial institutions, and accepted an economic relationship that prevented the development of the very industries that might have made Portugal genuinely independent. The Methuen Treaty of 1703 was the formalization of a dynamic that had existed informally for centuries, and its effects persisted long after the treaty itself became irrelevant. Portugal entered the 20th century as a nation whose economy was structured to export raw materials and import manufactured goods, the classic profile of a dependent economy, despite being the oldest colonial power in Europe. The demographic cost was equally enduring. 5 centuries of overseas enterprise had drained Portugal of millions of its most productive citizens. The men who sailed for India, who settled in Brazil, who garrisoned the African fortresses, who emigrated to escape poverty and conscription, were lost to the Portuguese economy permanently. The country that sent them could not replace them. The population of Portugal grew slowly, far more slowly than the populations of comparable European nations, because the natural increase was constantly offset by emigration. In the 20th century, even after the empire's economic relevance had declined to near zero, the emigration continued, driven now not by imperial adventure but by simple poverty. Portuguese workers left for France, for Germany, for Luxembourg, for Venezuela, for Canada, for anywhere that offered wages that Portugal's underdeveloped economy could not match. The country that had once sent explorers to the ends of the earth now sent laborers to the construction sites of Paris. The direction of the outflow had changed. The underlying cause, the failure of Portugal to develop an economy that could sustain its own population, had not. Portugal's entry into the European Economic Community in 1986, 12 years after the Revolution, marked the beginning of a genuine economic transformation, the first in the country's history that was driven by domestic development rather than colonial extraction. European structural funds financed infrastructure that the empire had never provided. Roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, the mundane machinery of a functioning modern economy were built in a single generation. Literacy rates rose. Per capita income converged toward European averages. The economy diversified. Tourism, technology, renewable energy, and high-value agriculture began to replace the raw material dependence that had characterized Portuguese economic life for 5 centuries. Portugal in the 21st century is a democratic European nation, whose identity is increasingly defined by its relationship to Europe and the Atlantic rather than by its imperial past. But the past is not gone. It cannot be gone, because its consequences are structural. The Lusophone world exists because of the empire. The racial composition of Brazil exists because of the slave trade. The political boundaries of Angola and Mozambique exist because European diplomats drew lines on maps in Berlin in 1884. The hidden Christians of Japan exist because Jesuit missionaries landed at Kagoshima in 1549. The port wine industry of the Douro Valley exists because of a trade treaty designed to channel Brazilian gold to English manufacturers. The genetic legacy of Portuguese expansion is written into the DNA of populations on 4 continents. The traces of encounters that were sometimes voluntary and more often not, preserved in chromosomes that carry no memory of the circumstances of their creation. The historian Charles Boxer, who spent his career studying the Portuguese Empire with a rigor and an honesty that made him unpopular with the Salazar regime, wrote that the Portuguese created a world on the move. They connected what had been separate. They made the global economy possible by linking the markets of 4 continents through sea routes that had not existed before they sailed them. They demonstrated that the ocean was not a barrier but a highway, and in doing so they inaugurated the age of globalization 5 centuries before the word was coined. This is true, and it matters, and it should not be diminished. But Boxer also wrote, with equal clarity, that the Portuguese Empire was built on violence and maintained by coercion, that its benefits flowed overwhelmingly to the colonizers and not to the colonized, and that its legacy in Africa, in Asia, and in the Americas was one of disruption, exploitation, and suffering that the passage of time has not yet healed. This is also true, and it also matters, and it should not be diminished either. The challenge of understanding Portugal's imperial history is the challenge of holding both truths simultaneously: the navigational genius and the slave ship, the caravel and the cartaz, the Geronimo's monastery and the sugar plantation, the map of the world and the hands that were cut off for failing to produce the required quota of cinnamon. These are not separate stories that can be told in isolation. They are the same story, driven by the same forces, executed by the same people, funded by the same treasury. Portugal did not accidentally build an empire while intending to do something else. It built an empire deliberately, knowing what it cost, recording the cost in its own chronicles, and continuing because the rewards for those who received them outweighed the suffering of those who did not. A nation of 1 million people conquered half the world. It is a sentence that contains both wonder and horror in equal measure, and the history it summarizes demands that we feel both simultaneously without allowing either to cancel the other. That is what intellectual honesty requires. That is what the dead on every side deserve, and the dead are numerous. They are the Portuguese sailors who slipped overboard in the night, or their bodies consumed by scurvy before they ever saw the coastline they had been sent to find. They are the African men and women packed into the holds of slave ships, breathing their last in the darkness of the Middle Passage, their names unrecorded, their descendants scattered across a hemisphere. They are the indigenous peoples of Brazil whose civilizations were dismantled by disease and dispossession, whose languages were silenced, whose lands were taken. They are the soldiers who died in the malarial swamps of Mozambique and the freezing mines of Minas Gerais and the burning streets of Goa. They are the Japanese Christians crucified at Nagasaki in 1597, 26 men and boys executed for the crime of believing what Portuguese missionaries had taught them. They are the conscripts of the colonial wars. Portuguese boys sent to fight in African jungles for an empire that their own officers knew was finished. They cannot speak for themselves, but their silence is not consent, and their absence from the historical record is not absence from the story. They are the story. They are the cost that the ledger books did not itemize and the chronicles did not always name, but that was paid in full by human beings whose lives were not less valuable for having been spent in the service of someone else's ambition. On the waterfront of Lisbon, where the Tagus River opens into the Atlantic, there stands a monument that tries to hold all of this at once. The Padrão dos Descobrimentos, the monument to the discoveries, was built in 1960 by the Salazar regime to celebrate the 500th anniversary of Henry the Navigator's death. Or it is a massive concrete structure shaped like the prow of a caravel, jutting out over the water as if the land itself were still reaching for the horizon. Along its sides, 33 stone figures stand in procession, led by Henry, his hand extending a small model ship toward the sea. Behind him marched the captains, the cartographers, the missionaries, the kings. Vasco da Gama is there, Afonso de Albuquerque, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, Bartolomeo Diaz, Fernão de Magalhães, whom the world calls Magellan. Luis de Camões, the poet who celebrated the voyages in his epic Os Lusíadas, while losing an eye in Morocco and nearly drowning in a shipwreck off the coast of Southeast Asia, holding his manuscript above the waves because the poem mattered more to him than his own survival. The monument was designed to inspire pride. It was designed to remind the Portuguese people, at a moment when the colonial wars were about to begin and the empire was about to enter its final violent chapter, that they were the heirs of something extraordinary. And it does inspire a kind of awe, standing at the base and looking up at those stone figures frozen in their eternal departure, their faces turned toward an ocean that they could not have known would demand everything they had and return less than it took. But the monument is also increasingly a site of contestation. There are no African figures on its sides. There are no enslaved people. There are no indigenous Brazilians. There are no Indian merchants whose trade networks the Portuguese disrupted. No Malay sultans whose cities they burned. No Japanese Christians whose faith cost them their lives. The monument tells half the story and calls it the whole, and the half it omits is the half that most of the world remembers most vividly. In recent years, the plaza surrounding the monument has become a space where these absences are debated, where school children are brought not only to admire the stone explorers but to ask who is missing and why. The conversation is uncomfortable. It is also necessary. And the fact that it is happening at all, in a country that for decades was forbidden by its own government from questioning the imperial narrative, is itself a measure of how far Portugal has traveled since the ship stopped sailing. The Portugal that exists today bears a relationship to the Portugal of Henry the Navigator that is simultaneously intimate and estranged, the way an adult relates to the child they once were, recognizing the continuity of identity while struggling to comprehend the distance between who they were and who they have become. The country is small. It has always been small. 10 million people now, which is roughly 10 times the population that sent Vasco da Gama around the Cape of Good Hope, and still a fraction of the populations of the nations it once competed against. Spain has 4.5 times as many people. France has 6 times. Germany has 8. The demographic asymmetry that defined Portuguese history from its founding has not changed. What has changed is what smallness means. In the 15th century, smallness meant vulnerability. It meant the constant threat of absorption by Castile, the impossibility of competing on land, the desperate turn toward the ocean as the only arena where a small nation could act with disproportionate effect. Smallness was the wound that drove everything. It drove Henry's obsession with the African coast. It drove Manuel's choice of da Gama, a hard man for a hard mission, because Portugal could not afford the luxury of sending a diplomat where it needed a weapon. It drove Albuquerque's strategy of chokepoints rather than territories because controlling nodes was what a nation of 1 million could do, while governing populations was what it could not. Every strategic innovation, every tactical adaptation, every institutional invention that made the Portuguese Empire possible was, at its root, a response to the fundamental problem of insufficient people. And smallness was also the empire's undoing. The same demographic limitation that forced Portugal to innovate also ensured that the innovations could not be sustained indefinitely. The empire ate its own people. It consumed them on the voyage out, in the garrisons, in the tropical disease environments, in the mines, and on the plantations, and it consumed them through emigration that was permanent, through desertion that was rational, through intermarriage that was encouraged because there was no alternative. Every generation, the pipeline from Portugal to the overseas world drew off more than the homeland could replace, and every generation, the structures that depended on that pipeline grew more fragile, more dependent on local resources and local manpower, more vulnerable to the competitors who arrived later, but with deeper reserves of the one resource that ultimately mattered more than ships or cannon or navigational knowledge: people. The Dutch broke the Portuguese monopoly in the Spice Islands not because they had better ships or better strategy, but because they had more men and more money, organized through a corporate structure that could mobilize capital and manpower on a scale that the Portuguese crown, operating as a unitary sovereign entity, could never match. The British replaced the Portuguese in India not through some superior moral vision, but through the sheer demographic and economic weight of a nation that by the 18th century was industrializing in ways that Portugal had never managed. The story of the Portuguese Empire's decline is not a story of failure. It is a story of limits. It is the story of what happens when a brilliant strategy designed to compensate for fundamental scarcity encounters competitors who do not suffer from the same scarcity and who adopt the same strategy with greater resources behind it. This is the deepest irony of Portuguese imperial history, and it is an irony that the Portuguese themselves have always understood, even when they could not bring themselves to articulate it. Portugal opened the doors. It mapped the routes. It proved the concepts. It demonstrated that a European nation could project power across oceans, that the wealth of Asia could be accessed by sea, that the Atlantic was not a wall but a road, that the world was connected in ways that no previous civilization had fully grasped, and then it watched as larger, richer, no more populous nations walked through the doors it had opened and claimed the wealth it had revealed. The spice trade that Portugal pioneered was taken over by the Dutch. The Indian commerce that da Gama inaugurated was eventually dominated by the British. The transatlantic world that Portuguese navigation made possible was shaped more decisively by Spain, France, and England than by Portugal itself. Even Brazil, the jewel of the Portuguese Empire, the territory that sustained Portuguese sovereignty for over a century after the Asian Empire collapsed, became independent and outgrew its mother country so thoroughly that by the 20th century, the colony's economy dwarfed the metropoles. Portugal created a world and then lost control of it, and not because it lacked the vision to see what it had made, but because it lacked the mass to hold it. There is a Portuguese word, saudade, that has no precise equivalent in any other language, and that the Portuguese themselves consider untranslatable. It is usually glossed as a deep, melancholic longing for something that is absent, a nostalgia sharpened by the knowledge that what is missed may never return. It is the emotion of exile, of separation, of irreversible loss experienced not as a single wound, but as a permanent condition. The fado music of Lisbon, with its mournful guitars and voices that seem to ache with something that cannot be named, is the artistic expression of saudade. And it is not an accident that fado emerged from the working-class neighborhoods of a city that had spent centuries watching its men depart on ships and wondering which of them would come back. Saudade is the emotional register of Portuguese imperial history. It is the feeling that pervades the chronicles of Gaspar Correa and João de Barros, the sense that even in the midst of conquest and triumph, something was being lost that could never be recovered. The men who sailed for India knew that they were leaving a world they might never see again, and the families they left behind knew the same. And the nation as a whole understood with a clarity that was sometimes conscious and sometimes merely intuited that every ship that departed was both a reaching outward and a bleeding away. The grandeur and the grief were inseparable. They were the same act experienced from different perspectives, the outward face of ambition and the inward face of cost. And the Portuguese, to their credit and their sorrow, never fully succeeded in pretending that one could exist without the other. Camões understood this. The poet who is to Portugal what Shakespeare is to England and Dante is to Italy published Os Lusíadas in 1572, a decade and a half before the disaster at Alcácer Quibir. And the poem is both a celebration of Portuguese expansion and a lament for what it was already costing. The poem's hero is Vasco da Gama, and its subject is the voyage to India, but its emotional undertow is loss. The nymphs who seduce the sailors are figures of enchantment that will be paid for with suffering. The prophecies that promise glory also promise destruction. The goddess who grants the Portuguese dominion over the seas does so with the unspoken understanding that dominion is a burden as much as a gift, and that the nation that bears it will be transformed in ways that cannot be undone. Camões himself was the embodiment of this paradox. He spent years in the East, in Goa and Macau, soldiering and writing and suffering, losing an eye in combat, shipwrecked, imprisoned, impoverished, and he returned to Lisbon with nothing but his poem. He died in 1580, the year Spain absorbed Portugal, and his last recorded words, probably apocryphal but emotionally precise, were that he was dying not only in his country, but with it. 5 centuries after Henry the Navigator stared at the ocean from the cliffs of Sagres, the ocean stares back. It is visible from almost everywhere in Portugal. A country so narrow that the sea is never far away, a constant presence shimmering on the western horizon, catching the late afternoon light in colors that shift from silver to gold to copper as the sun descends. The Atlantic is still there. It is still the same water that carried the caravels south along the African coast, that swallowed the men who died of scurvy in the night, that bore the slave ships to Brazil and the pepper fleets from India and the gold of Minas Gerais to the docks of Lisbon. The ocean does not remember any of this. It does not know that it was the medium through which a small nation reshaped the world. It does not care. It is indifferent to human ambition and human suffering in equal measure, and its indifference is, in a way, the most honest commentary on the entire Portuguese imperial enterprise. Because the ocean was never Portuguese. The mare clausum, the closed sea that Albuquerque attempted to enforce through cannon and cartaz, was always a fantasy maintained by violence against the physical reality of water that belongs to no one and that moves according to laws that no human authority can amend. The Portuguese tried to own the ocean, and for a few decades they came closer than anyone before or since, patrolling its surface with armed ships, taxing its traffic, dictating who could sail and who could not. But the ocean was always bigger than the ambition. And the ambition was always bigger than the nation, and the nation was always too small for what it attempted, and too proud to stop attempting it. This is what makes the Portuguese story different from every other European imperial narrative, and what gives it a quality that is not quite tragedy and not quite triumph, but something that partakes of both without resolving into either. The British Empire was built by a nation with the resources to sustain it, and its decline, while painful, was the decline of a power that had alternatives. Britain after Empire was still an industrial nation, still a financial center, still a military power of significant capacity. The French Empire was built and lost and partially rebuilt and lost again, but France was never defined by its empire the way Portugal was, because France had always been a great European power regardless of its overseas possessions. Spain's empire was larger than Portugal's in territory and probably richer in aggregate wealth, but Spain was never as dependent on its empire for its national identity. Because Spain had always been a major European kingdom with a large population and a diversified economy. Portugal had none of these cushions. The empire was not an appendage to Portuguese national identity. It was Portuguese national identity. Without the empire, Portugal was a small, poor country on the edge of Europe. With the empire, it was something unprecedented, a nation that punched so far above its weight that the metaphor breaks down entirely. Because a nation of 1 million people controlling territory on 4 continents is not punching above its weight. It is operating in a different category of reality altogether, defying the normal relationship between resources and results so completely that the achievement seems almost fictional when stated plainly. And that is why the end of the empire, when it finally came in 1974 and 1975, was experienced in Portugal not merely as the loss of overseas territories, but as an identity crisis of existential proportions. If Portugal was not an empire, what was it? If the 500-year project that had given the nation its purpose, its prestige, its sense of difference from other European nations was over, then what was left? These were questions that the Carnation Revolution forced upon a nation that had been forbidden from asking them for decades, and the answers are still being formulated, still being debated, still being lived. The Portugal that entered the European Union in 1986 chose implicitly and then explicitly to answer the question by looking not outward toward the ocean and the former colonies, but inward toward Europe and toward itself. The decision to seek European integration was, in its way, as radical a strategic reorientation as Henry the Navigator's turn toward the Atlantic. For 5 centuries, Portugal had defined itself in opposition to Europe, as a nation that had escaped the continental trap by taking to the sea, that had found in the ocean the scope and wealth that the land denied it. To turn toward Europe was to accept that the oceanic era was over, that the future lay not in distant possessions, but in continental relationships, that Portugal's smallness could be managed not by reaching for the world, but by embedding itself in a community of nations where smallness was not a disadvantage because the community provided the scale that individual nations lacked. This reorientation has been, by most measures, the most successful strategic choice Portugal has made since the development of the caravel. The transformation of Portuguese society since 1986, the growth in income, the improvement in education, the development of infrastructure, the consolidation of democracy, the emergence of a modern, diversified economy represents a more durable improvement in the lives of ordinary Portuguese people than anything the empire ever provided. The empire enriched kings and nobles and merchants. European integration enriched the nation. The distinction matters. It is the distinction between wealth extracted from others and wealth generated by oneself, between prosperity built on coercion and prosperity built on productivity, between an economy that passes wealth through and an economy that creates it. But the past does not release its grip so easily. Portugal's relationship with its imperial history remains unresolved in ways that are visible in public life, in political debate, in the conversations that happen in families and classrooms, and the comment sections of newspaper articles whenever the subject arises. The Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology in Lisbon, a sleek contemporary building on the waterfront near the site from which da Gama departed, hosts exhibitions that critically examine the colonial past. But a few hundred meters away, the monument to the discoveries still stands with its stone explorers forever departing, and the tourists still come to photograph it. And the question of whether the monument should be contextualized, modified, or simply left as it is remains a matter of genuine disagreement. The Portuguese historian Diogo Ramada Curto has written that Portugal suffers from a double impossibility. The impossibility of celebrating the empire without ignoring its victims, and the impossibility of condemning it without denying the genuine courage and achievement of the individuals who built it. This double impossibility is not a failure of Portuguese historical consciousness. It is an accurate reflection of the historical reality. The empire was both. It was always both. And any resolution that eliminates one dimension in favor of the other is not a resolution but an amputation. The same double impossibility confronts every nation that was shaped by Portuguese expansion. Brazil cannot tell its national story without acknowledging both the Portuguese colonial framework that created it and the African and indigenous peoples whose labor, suffering, and cultural contributions built it. Angola cannot understand its present without understanding the centuries of slave trading that depopulated its interior and the colonial war that devastated its last generation under Portuguese rule. Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, Timor-Leste, Goa, Macau, each of these places carries the imprint of Portuguese contact in its language, its religion, its architecture, its genetic inheritance, and its historical memory. And in none of them is that imprint experienced as a simple thing. The Lusophone world that Portugal created is in the end the empire's most enduring and most ambiguous legacy. 260 million people speak a language that originated in a country of 1 million. 9 nations spread across 4 continents share a linguistic inheritance that connects them to each other and to a common history that none of them chose and none of them can escape. The Community of Portuguese Language Countries, the CPLP, established in 1996, attempts to transform this inheritance into something collaborative, a network of nations linked by language and history who can support each other in the present rather than remaining trapped in the power dynamics of the past. Whether this effort will succeed, whether the colonial wound can be transmuted into a post-colonial connection, is a question that the 21st century is still answering. What is not in question is the scale of what happened. A country of 1 million people altered the trajectory of human civilization. It did so through a combination of geographic desperation, institutional innovation, individual courage, collective ruthlessness, and a willingness to endure suffering and inflict suffering that was sustained across centuries. It created the first global empire. It inaugurated the age of European expansion. It connected the world's oceans into a single navigable system for the first time in human history. It also enslaved millions of human beings, destroyed civilizations, disrupted ecosystems, and established patterns of exploitation that persist in modified forms to this day. The story does not end with a moral. Morals are for fables, and this is not a fable, it is history. Which means it is the record of what human beings actually did when they were frightened, ambitious, desperate, cruel, brave, greedy, visionary, and small. The Portuguese were all of these things, often simultaneously, and the world they made bears the marks of every one of those qualities. On the waterfront of Lisbon, in the early evening, when the light turns golden and the Tagus glitters under a sky that is softening toward dusk, you can stand where the sailors stood 500 years ago and look out at the same water they looked at. The river is wide here, almost like a lake, and beyond it the Atlantic stretches west and south toward continents that were unknown when the first caravels slipped their moorings and caught the tide. The monument is behind you. The monastery that Manuel built with pepper money is to your left. The old city climbs the hills in layers of white and ochre and tile, the same hills that the weeping crowd stood on when the fleets departed. The water does not remember, but you can stand there in the fading light and listen. And if you listen carefully enough, past the traffic and the tourists and the streetcars rattling up the Alfama, you can almost hear it. The creak of timber and rope, the snap of canvas filling with wind, the sound of a small nation with no right to succeed and no option but to try, pushing off from the shore and sailing toward the edge of everything it knew, into an ocean that promised nothing and delivered the world.